Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something ancient, alluring and honestly kind of unhinged. We're not just time travelling, we're plunging into the candlelit underworld of ancient Greek sex rituals. Yeah, you read that right. From sacred brothels to drunken cults, the Greeks did not hold back when it came to mixing religion, politics, philosophy and, well, lots of nakedness. And guess what? You probably won't survive this. Not socially, intellectually or even morally. But it's going to be a fun ride, I promise. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean, I'm about to guide you through a 30-part epic about naked priests and divine seduction. Bare minimum, I deserve a thumbs up, right? Oh, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Just curious how many of you are lying in bed at 2:17 AM wondering, did ancient Greeks really have sex in the middle of temples? Spoiler, yes, but we'll get to that. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a stone pathway slick with spilled wine and olive oil. The air hums with flute music and distant drums. It's nighttime, but the moon's high enough to cast your shadow as you push past a vine-draped archway into what looks like a massive garden party. Except, the people here? They're mostly wearing masks, not much else, and doing things that... well, we can't describe too graphically if we want to keep this as PG-13. Welcome to an orgy. And no, not that kind of orgy. Well, okay, yes. But also no. This is a religious rite. A sacred festival. You're in the middle of a Dionysian celebration. And the line between ritual and rapture. It vanished several goblets ago. To your left, a high priestess sways with a thyrsus. A tall staff crowned with ivy and a pine cone. Her eyes roll back in ecstasy, but she's not faking it. These ceremonies are designed to induce something called ecstasis, a divine out-of-body state where boundaries blur between mortal and God, self and other. That means dancing, drinking, chanting, sometimes screaming, and yes, plenty of physical expression. You're probably underdressed, overdressed, and 100% confused. Here's the wild part. This isn't just party culture gone ancient. The Greeks believed that controlled chaos was necessary to balance the strict rationalism of daily life. Let it all out now, your lust, your fear, your madness, so you can go back to being a good citizen tomorrow. It's almost wholesome if you squint. As you walk deeper into the grove, someone hands you a cup, wine, probably mixed with honey, maybe laced with something else. You take a sip, feel it burn down your throat. The world feels warmer, louder. You pass a tree strung with amulets shaped like, well, definitely phallic. Everything here is symbolic, exaggerated, and on full display. Sexuality isn't hidden, it's elevated, honoured and theatrical. The Greeks didn't separate the erotic from the sacred. In fact, the gods were usually right in the thick of it. Dionysus, the host of this particular gathering, isn't just the god of wine. He's the patron of theatre, madness, ecstasy and breaking social rules. In his honour, worshippers perform the orgia, secretive night rituals outside the city. Only initiates allowed. And if you're caught gossiping about what happened here, well, historically you could be executed, so let's keep it between us. One historical account comes from Euripides' Bacchae, where women abandon their homes, flee to the mountains, and, under the influence of Dionysus, rip animals limb from limb in a divine frenzy. Not exactly the girls' night out you imagined, huh? But there's debate among scholars whether this is literal or metaphorical. Was it a real rite? Or a warning parable about the dangers of unrestrained female power? You see a young man stumble past you, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. He's not drunk. Well, not just drunk. He's been possessed, maybe. Taken over by the spirit of the god. That was the goal, after all. To become entheos, in God, which, fun fact, is the root of the word enthusiasm. Makes your last pep rally feel kind of tame, doesn't it? Over near a marble altar, two masked figures are locked in a slow ritualistic dance. It's hypnotic, part theatre, part seduction, and clearly choreographed for more than just dramatic effect. A priestess draws symbols in ash across her chest and begins a chant that you swear is shaking the trees. You don't understand the words, but your spine tingles anyway. And here's a fringe little detail. Some cults believe that achieving mania, divine madness, could grant visions of the future. So sex, wine, and rhythm weren't just entertainment, they were tools, methods for piercing the veil. Orgasm as prophecy. You start to wonder, is that what all the moaning was about? Yet not everyone approved of these rites. Later philosophers like Plato were deeply uncomfortable with the whole thing. In his perfect society, he would have kept the Dionysians far away from the city walls. Too chaotic, too wild. But Plato wasn't in charge here. Dionysus was. And tonight, anything goes. As the night deepens, you're ushered toward a cave entrance, narrow, torchlit, and echoing with sounds you definitely don't hear at your local church. You're told this is the path to initiation, to be reborn through experience. Your heart races. Are you ready for what's inside? Doesn't matter. You're already stepping through. In a world where rational thought built temples and mathematical theories are ours, it's easy to forget the Greeks also embraced the irrational with equal fervour. Sex wasn't shameful, it was divine. It was a way to touch gods, blur reality, and transcend self. And as you follow the flickering lights into the dark, wine-slicked earth, you're starting to understand why. The torchlight flickers against the damp walls as you descend deeper into the cave, shadows stretching in every direction like they're trying to pull you back or push you forward. Your footsteps echo against ancient stone, the air turning cool and thick, scented with burnt resin and something oddly sweet. Maybe myrrh or crushed laurel. You're not alone, others move with you. Some chantan, some whispering prayers or softly humming melodies in a language you don't quite understand. They're all dressed in flowing linen or nothing at all. You're suddenly aware of your own heartbeat, your clothes, your body. Everything feels exposed, even if it's not. This is no ordinary cave. You've just entered a sanctuary of one of Greece's mystery cults, secret religious groups that promise spiritual rebirth and hidden knowledge, but only if you gave yourself completely. And by completely they meant mind, body, soul, and yes, sometimes more than a little flesh. The most famous of these cults was the Eleusinian mysteries centred around the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone. You know, the one who got abducted by Hades and had to spend half the year in the underworld? Classic family trauma. But here in the dark, that myth isn't just a story. It's a sacred script, and you're now a character in by it. Initiates, called Mystai, would reenact Persephone's descent and return, hoping to glimpse the same kind of death-defying insight. There were torches, chants, and symbolis acts of purification. And though the official line says nothing too explicit happened, unofficial whispers suggest otherwise. And Eleusis wasn't alone. All over Greece, smaller and sometimes weirder mystery cults flourished, each with their own gods, rites, and, let's say, hands-on theology. Some honoured Cybele, the wild Anatolian mother goddess whose priests castrated themselves in ecstatic frenzy. Others followed Orpheus, the legendary musician who claimed you could purify your soul and maybe your sins through secret knowledge and possibly long ritualized embraces under the stars. Scholarly debate still rages on how sexual these ceremonies actually were. Some argue it was mostly symbolic, while others point out how often sacred objects look suspiciously like sex toys. You reach a stone chamber where hooded figures stand in a circle, each holding a flickering lamp. In the centre, a low altar, and a bowl of something thick and steaming. You're handed a cup, lukewarm, bitter, and earthy. Welcome to Kikion, the sacred brew. Historically it was made from barley, water, and a mint, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest it may have been laced with psychoactive substances. In other words, it's a mystical smoothie with a mind of its own. You drink. Slowly your surroundings begin to shimmer. The walls pulse. The hooded figures start to chant in low rhythmic tones, and you feel your own voice join in without trying. A woman steps forward, entirely bare but for a gold chain at her waist. She speaks a line from a sacred hymn, something about the womb, the earth, an eternity. And suddenly she isn't just a woman, she's Persephone or Demeter or someone in between. And just like that, your logical brain bows out, leaving room for something older and deeper. One of the more controversial beliefs among mystery cults was that spiritual union could be achieved through physical union. A ritual embrace between initiates, or even between devotee and priestess, could mimic the act of divine creation. To be clear, not every mystery cult did this. Some were strict ascetics, rejecting sex and wine entirely, but others believed that climax was a kind of mini-death, a moment where the soul slipped loose and brushed the edge of the infinite. You move forward, half floating, half hypnotized. You're drawn into a dance, not fast, not frantic, but ritualistic. Every movement choreographed, every touch deliberate. This isn't casual affection, it's sacrament, a reenactment of the union between heaven and earth, of gods descending and mortals rising. Around you, the walls seem to melt into stars. Quirky fact, some of these mystery rites included actors playing gods who during the final ceremonies revealed the sacred truth to initiates, often in the form of a giant veiled phallus or womb. Literal symbols of creation, sure, but also deeply human reminders of where we all come from. The ancients weren't shy about such imagery. If anything, they saw our discomfort as a symptom of being too far removed from nature, from divinity, from truth. There's a reason these cults stayed underground, both literally and politically. The secrecy was strict. Breaking it wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. One guy, a playwright named Aeschylus, was accused of revealing Eleusinian secrets in a public play. He only escaped punishment by swearing he hadn't actually been initiated. Probably a good move. Others weren't so lucky. You blink and suddenly you're back in the torchlit corridor. Your head is spinning, your heart calm but alert. Something has shifted. You're not the same person who entered the cave. Whether it was the Kikian, the chant, the touch, or the mystery itself, you feel expanded. Not enlightened exactly, but softened around the edges, open. As you climb back up into the night air, the stars overhead seem sharper, more present. The grove is quieter now. The wine-soaked revelry has faded into a slow, murmuring hum. People rest against trees or lie curled beside fire pits. You find a quiet place to sit, not far from the stone entrance, and let your mind drift. Was this real? Were the gods present? Or was it all a deeply theatrical illusion, engineered to stir up primal awe? Scholars can't agree. Some say the mystery rites were just elaborate plays with religious branding. Others insist they offered genuine psychological transformation, maybe even early forms of therapy. One thing's for sure, no one walked away unaffected. You stare at the flickering flames and try to hold on to what you felt in the cave, the rhythm, the heat, the total surrender. Tomorrow you'll be back in the rational daylight nodding along to philosophers and paying taxes. But tonight, you've glimpsed something older than language, something that vibrates in the body, not just the mind. You lie back, close your eyes, and hear the last chant of the night echo in your memory. It's in a language you don't understand, but you get the meaning anyway. You wake with dirt in your hair, the smell of smoke still clinging to your clothes, and a subtle soreness in your legs that reminds you, last night wasn't a dream. The cave, the chants, the ritual embrace, yeah, that all happened. Or at least something did. But now it's morning and the world feels flatter somehow, too clean, like you've been popped out of a divine fever dream and dumped back into a city that expects you to keep your tunic on. Athens looms ahead of you now, white marble gleaming in the sunlight, orderly columns rising like ribs out of the land. But don't be fooled by all the statues and math. Beneath that shining exterior lies a city that loves chaos almost as much as order. And no one embodies that contradiction better than Dionysus. You wander toward the theatre district, and it hits you. This is his turf. The god of madness, wine, and unfiltered feeling is also the god of drama, of masks, of letting yourself be someone else for a night, or for a season. And right now, the city's gearing up for the Dionysia, a multi-day festival that starts with sacrifices and ends with full-on emotional combustion. You follow a trail of flower petals and goat droppings, we'll get to that, and find yourself at the edge of the theatre of Dionysus. The crowd is already forming. Nobles and peasants alike pouring in. The lines blur here. For Dionysus, everyone's welcome, if you can handle him. Someone hands you a mask, one of those exaggerated ones with the wide-open mouth and arched brows. Tragedy or comedy? Hard to tell. You slip it on and instantly you don't feel like yourself anymore. Back in the day, putting on a mask wasn't just for performance. It was an act of surrender, of transformation. You weren't pretending, you were channeling. The actors weren't playing roles. They were vessels for something sacred, something strange. And in this festival, everyone was part of the show. As the sun rises higher, the ritual begins. First, a goat is sacrificed, hence the droppings, and its blood is offered to the god. You flinch as the animal is led forward, but the crowd is solemn, even reverent. This isn't cruelty, it's currency, blood for blessing, flesh for revelation. The performances that follow are intense, not just a play, but an emotional exorcism. The themes are heavy. Murder, Revenge, forbidden desire. One tragedy features a queen who unknowingly marries her son. Another, a king who tears out his eyes when he discovers the truth. You're probably thinking, where's the sex ritual? But it's all connected. Dionysus isn't just about wine and party hats. He's about what happens when you let go, of logic, of inhibition, of the social masks we wear, and that includes sexual boundaries. You'll see it in the plays. Husbands seducing strangers disguised as gods, women driven to madness by divine lust, incest, adultery, gender swaps. It's all there, raw and unapologetic. And the audience, they eat it up. Not because they're perverts, well, maybe a little, but because these stories hold power. They name the things people are too scared to speak aloud. One particularly haunting myth comes up again and again in the Dionysian festivals, the story of Pentheus. He's a straight-laced king who tries to shut down Dionysus's cult. No drinking, no dancing, no wild women running through the hills. Big mistake. Dionysus lures him out of the city disguised as a woman, drives him into the woods, and surprise, Pentheus ends up torn apart by his own mother, who's so deep in her trance she thinks he's a lion. Real family-friendly stuff. But there's a deeper layer. Pentheus didn't just oppose Dionysus. He repressed the part of himself that wanted to join the revels, the part that was curious, maybe even aroused by what he saw, so the god punished him, not for his fear, but for his denial. Modern scholars can't agree on what to make of all this. Was the Pentheus myth a warning against denying your shadow self? A coded critique of sexual repression? Or just a good old-fashioned bloodbath with a moral twist? Some even argue that Dionysus represents a kind of gender-fluid divine energy, crossing boundaries not just of sanity, but of identity. In early art, he's shown with soft features, flowing hair often draped in women's robes. Is he male, female, both, neither? The ancients weren't always interested in clarity. There's a scene in one comedy, probably staged right on this very theatre floor, where a character disguises himself as a woman to infiltrate a religious ritual. It's crude, sure, but the audience loves it. They're howling not just at the slapstick, but at the tension. What happens when you step into someone else's body? When you blur the lines of who you are and what you desire? That's the real Dionysian mystery. Not just the parties, but the peeling away of self. And nowhere is that more intense than in the Maenads, Dionysus's female followers. You see a few actors on stage dressed as them now, their hair loose, their eyes wild. In myth, they'd run off into the mountains, leaving husbands and children behind to live in divine frenzy and according to some tales, their rituals involved group dances that escalated into orgiastic ecstasy, and possibly literal dismemberment. Again, there's some scholarly disagreement. Were these just metaphorical tearing away of roles and identities? Or were they ripping deer apart with their bare hands? Either way, the message is clear. Don't mess with women who've been blessed and unhinged by Dionysus. The performance ends with a silence so heavy you can hear birdsong. The actors bow. The masks come off. People begin to murmur and stretch, but you sit there, mask in hand, unable to shake the feeling that something inside you got shifted. You think back to last night in the cave, to the god who poured madness into your cup, and now to the state where those same energies were made visible. Sex, power, loss, laughter, it's all part of the same ritual, the same divine unravelling. The Greeks didn't separate intellect from passion, or body from soul, they wanted it messier. You walk away from the theatre in a daze. The city's waking up now, merchants opening stalls, kids chasing each other between marble pillars. It should feel normal. It doesn't. Not after seeing what you've seen, not after feeling Dionysus press his fingerprints into your mind. And as you glance at your reflection in a bronze shield hanging near a stall, you wonder, how much of you is still you? By now, the sun's starting to slip lower in the sky, but the city isn't slowing down. If anything, Athens is heating up again, like it never really cools off, just shifts gears. You're walking through narrow alleys behind the agora, guided by whispers, sandals on stone, past vendors shutting up shop and gossiping about whose olive oil was adulterated and which politician's son has mysteriously fled town. But you're not here for politics. You're headed somewhere older, softer, and much more complicated. You're headed into the presence of Aphrodite. Let's get one thing straight. Aphrodite isn't just a goddess of love. She's lust incarnate, divine desire with a disarming smile and a reputation for breaking hearts and making wars. She was born from sea foam, depending on the myth, from the severed genitals of Uranus tossed into the ocean. So yeah, Subtlety was never really her thing. You finally reach the temple of Aphrodite Pandemos, of all the people, perched on the edge of the Acropolis. It's less grand than you expected, more intimate. And there's a scent in the air here that isn't incense. It's perfume, warm skin, oil-slicked marble and crushed rose petals. And, okay, maybe a little sweat. Outside the temple, young women lounge under a vine-covered awning, laughing softly and exchanging coins with passing men and women. Their robes are dyed brighter than average, saffron yellows, deep purples, and their eyes follow you as you approach. Some nod, one smiles. There's no shame here, no need for it, because here, sex is not a transaction of sin, it's a sacred offering, a ritual act of honouring beauty, fertility, and the ache that keeps humans restless. Inside the temple, it's cooler, shadowy. Statues of the goddess line the inner walls, nude, of course, but always with a twist. A hand lifted to her breast, or caught mid-smile, or stepping delicately out of the water. Every inch is calculated to inspire longing. You feel it tug at you, even though she's stone. That's Aphrodite's whole thing. She doesn't need to be alive to seduce you. At the altar, a woman dressed in silver and white is lighting a small flame. She glances at you, eyes sharp and amused. "Make an offering," she says. "It works better if you mean it." You reach into your pouch and pull out a coin, plain bronze, nothing fancy, and place it beside the others. Around you, soft music begins to play. A lyre, barely audible, strumming something slow and looping. Now here's the hot debate. Were these temple women priestesses? Courtesans, sex workers? Or something in between? The modern label sacred prostitute gets tossed around a lot, but historians fight over it like philosophers at a symposium with too much wine. Some argue that Aphrodite's temples employed hetairai, educated, socially skilled companions who offered more than just physical pleasure. Others insist the whole temple sex idea is a mistranslation of poetic metaphor. And then there are the inscriptions. Corinth especially had a reputation. One source famously claimed it had over 1,000 temple prostitutes. Is that true? Probably not, but enough people believed it that the city still blushes in academic papers. As the lyre continues, a woman approaches you. Her skin glows, her voice is low, and she doesn't speak at first, just reaches out and takes your hand. You follow without resistance. This isn't about seduction in the modern sense, it's choreography, ceremony. She leads you past curtains into a side chamber, where the walls are painted with scenes of lovers, some mythological, some painfully human. There's Persephone with Adonis, Helen and Paris, Achilles and Patroclus tangled in each other's arms like they're both trying to disappear. The woman gently presses your palm to her chest and says, "This is a temple, not a brothel. Don't confuse the two, and you don't, because this isn't about you, it's about Aphrodite, the goddess who demands worship not with sacrifice but with surrender. Whether or not you offer your body is secondary. What matters is your willingness to let go of control, to desire and be desired, to feel vulnerable and electric at the same time." Let's throw in a quirky fact. Some ancient cults of Aphrodite required initiates to wear gender-swapped clothing during rituals. Men in veils and jewellery, women with daggers and short tunics. The point wasn't kink, it was empathy, perspective. How can you worship beauty unless you understand how it's seen from all angles? Back in the main chamber, more visitors are arriving. A middle-aged couple holding hands, a soldier home from campaign, a woman alone, barefoot, carrying a small statue of the goddess wrapped in cloth. You get the sense that everyone's here for a reason, though none of them would ever say it out loud. That's the other thing Aphrodite's good at, keeping secrets, and secrets, as you're learning, were the currency of the ancient world. Greeks didn't air their inner lives. They told myths instead, stories about gods seducing mortals, about forbidden love and magical unions. Why confess to longing when you can frame it as divine intervention? "I didn't fall in love with my brother's wife. Eros struck me." Or, "I didn't mean to sleep with a swan. It was Zeus." Speaking of, you spot a small statue of Leda tucked in a corner, mid-embrace with the infamous swan. Her expression is serene. Blissed out. The sculptor clearly wasn't worried about realism, but there's a joke here too, a soft, sly smile in the curve of her mouth. Did she really believe a god took that form? Or did she just need the story to survive what happened? You sit near the entrance now, watching the glow of the oil lamps reflect in polished marble. Everything about this place is designed to slow you down, to soften you. Aphrodite is patient. She doesn't rush. Her power isn't in conquest, it's in invitation. She waits for you to fall, and then she reminds you it was your idea all along. Outside, the city's cooling into evening. You stand, nod toward the altar one last time, and step into the golden haze of sunset. Somewhere behind you, laughter drifts out of the temple gates. Not mocking, not seductive, just warm. The kind of laughter that says, "We know, we've all felt it too." And maybe that's what this place is really for. Not just pleasure, not just ritual, but recognition. A place where people could admit just for a moment that they wanted, that they longed, that they were human. Even after you leave the Temple of Aphrodite, the scent of rose oil seems to cling to you. Not on your clothes exactly, but somewhere behind your eyes, in the folds of your memory. The city feels different now, more alive, more watchful, like every statue has eyes and every breeze is trying to tell you something. You head east toward the centre of town, the flickering lamplight guiding your way as the streets narrow. Here, behind a walled courtyard and under the shadow of a marble column, waits one of the most paradoxical figures in Greek society, the virgin priestess. You're brought to the temple of Hestia, the hearth goddess. She doesn't have the flash of Aphrodite or the wild reputation of Dionysus. Hestia is quiet, stable, unshaken. She keeps the home fire burning, literally. Every city had a communal hearth dedicated to her, and Athens was no exception. And who tends the fire here? Not burly priests or wild-eyed initiates. No, a young girl, maybe 13, maybe a little older, the Erephoros. You watch her as she sweeps the temple floor, her hair tied up in ribbons, her eyes lowered in silence. She looks delicate, almost too small for the gravity of the job. But don't let that fool you. She holds one of the most sacred and mysterious roles in the city. She is a virgin, not just in body but in function, untouched, set apart. She doesn't belong to her father anymore, nor her future husband. She belongs to the gods. Now here's where it gets strange. Every year, 2 girls were chosen from noble families to serve as Erephorai. Their duties were mostly symbolic, tending the temple, participating in ceremonies, helping with weaving the sacred robe for Athena. But there was one ritual that still gives scholars night sweats, the Erephoria. In the dead of night, these girls would carry unknown objects, some say sacred, some say shameful, down a secret passage beneath the Acropolis. They weren't allowed to look inside the containers they carried. They weren't told what they held. They just walked, barefoot and silent, into the earth. You're standing now at the top of that ancient stairway, looking down into darkness. The same tunnel those girls used in thousands of years ago. No one knows for sure what was in the boxes. Some suggest phallic idols. Others whisper about symbolic wombs, miscarried fetuses, or even secret offerings to underworld deities. It was meant to be unspeakable, which naturally makes everyone want to talk about it. There's a debate, of course there is, about whether this was a symbolic rite of passage, a death and rebirth metaphor. Or was it something much more visceral? Was it tied to fertility, to sexuality, to a girl's looming transition into womanhood? Or was it simply a weird form of civic obedience training? Carry the sacred box, don't ask questions, and grow up a good Athenian wife. But that's just the start. You follow the girl into a quieter chamber at the back of the temple, where a tiny, flickering hearth burns. This fire has been maintained for generations, passed like a relay torch from one young priestess to the next. And with it, the unspoken expectations, purity, restraint, service. The irony, of course, is that while these girls were being ritually sequestered for their innocence, the entire city was wrapped in mythologies full of divine seduction and mortal compromise. Virginity was a sacred state, but only until it wasn't. It was treasured, yes, but also temporary. Even the goddess Athena, supposed paragon of chastity, was surrounded by stories involving peeping gods, accidental arousals, and tragic punishments. Look up the story of Tiresias sometime. He walked in on Athena bathing, and she blinded him for it. The penalty for seeing too much? Permanent darkness. But she did give him the gift of prophecy, so, fair trade. You glance again at the priestess. She's lighting the evening incense now, face bathed in soft glow. There's a sadness to it, maybe. Or maybe it's just the weight of knowing everyone's watching. These girls couldn't be touched, couldn't speak too freely, couldn't laugh too loudly. Their virtue was both armour and cage. And yet, they held power, subtle, strange power. in a society that usually shut women out of politics, economics, and philosophy. Here were young girls at the heart of the city's spiritual life. They carried the keys to its rituals. They whispered prayers on behalf of an entire population. Their voices, soft though they were, spoke directly to the divine. Quirky fact, there was a statue near the entrance of the temple called the Herm of Hestia. Most herms were, well, graphic, as in giant carved phalluses mounted on street corners to ward off bad luck. But Hestia's Herm, no genitals. Just a serene face and a pedestal. It was a physical contradiction, public virility for the hearth goddess who demanded silence and restraint. And yet somehow both coexisted. Just like the priestesses and the courtesans, the orgia and the fasting, the sacred box and the forbidden gaze. Ancient Greece didn't shy away from contradiction. It danced in it. As the fire in the hearth burns low, the young priestess begins her final prayer of the day. You can't hear the words, but the tone is reverent. Practiced. She doesn't look up, doesn't even seem to notice you. And for a moment that feels right. You are the observer here. She is the vessel. And the ritual, whether or not you understand it, continues, like it always has. You leave the temple in silence, stepping back into the city where everything seems louder now. Footsteps, laughter, dogs barking somewhere down the alley. The marble streets shimmer under the moonlight. You pass a group of boys kicking a ball made from tied-up rags. One of them glances at you and says, "Did you see the fire, girl?" You nod, not quite sure how to answer. As you head back toward your quarters, one question follows you like a whisper. What was in the box? You don't sleep much that night. Something about that silent priestess, the mystery box, and the underground stairway keeps looping in your head like a dream you half remember. And when you do finally drift off, it's to the sound of distant flute music and the echo of footsteps in marble corridors. Morning arrives too quickly. With a sky smeared orange and gold and the smell of baking bread drifting through your window. But today, you're heading somewhere far less sacred, at least at first glance. You make your way down a hill toward a wide tiled courtyard where men are already gathering in clusters, lounging on low couches, laughing too loudly for the hour, sipping watered wine out of shallow bowls. Welcome to the symposium. You're not here as a servant or a philosopher or even a full citizen. You're just observing. But even as a ghost at the feast, you're about to witness something equal parts brilliant, bizarre, and deeply uncomfortable. First thing you notice, it's all men. Women, if present, are entertainers. Flute girls, dancers, or the occasional courtesan, but never full participants. This is a male world. Part frat house, part TED Talk, part therapy session, and part something else entirely. The host greets everyone with exaggerated hospitality. He's wearing a garland of ivy and already slurring his words. Tonight, he proclaims, we drink for Dionysus, speak for wisdom, and celebrate beauty. A murmur of approval goes around the room. You take a spot near the edge, next to a painted column, and try to look invisible. The wine is served first, cut with water because drinking it straight is barbaric apparently. That doesn't stop anyone from getting wrecked by the third round. And as the cups go down, the conversation spirals. At first, it's as light. Poetry, jokes, the latest scandal in the agora. But soon it shifts. The man across from you, a wiry figure with sun-creased skin and an intense stare, begins talking about love. Not the soft, romantic kind. No, this is philosophical love, the kind that separates the base from the divine. There are two types of love, he says. Common and celestial. His audience leans in, he continues. Common love is of the body, a physical hunger. But celestial love, that is of the soul. And it exists only between men. A few heads nod. A younger man, barely out of his teens, grins and sips his wine. Here it is, laid bare, pederasty, the complicated, controversial, and deeply embedded social structure that links mentorship with desire. Older men, known as eristai, would court adolescent boys, eromenoi, with gifts, poetry, and yes, often physical intimacy. This wasn't considered taboo, it was expected, even encouraged among the upper classes. The goal, at least in theory, wasn't just seduction, it was education, shaping the boy into a virtuous citizen, forming his soul. The room buzzes with variations on this theme. One man recites verses from Sappho, delicate, aching leans about longing and loss. Another interrupts with a crude joke about wrestlers and olive oil. Everyone laughs. The two extremes are always close here. Beauty and base instinct, sacred and scandalous. You can't help noticing that the celestial love speeches often come from the older, heavier men, with suspiciously clingy protégés reclining nearby. Quirky detail, there was actually a legal age for an Eromenos to accept gifts. If a boy accepted a rooster, a traditional courtship gift, before puberty, it was considered shameful. That's right, a literal rooster. Part symbol, part breakfast, maybe. You're not sure what's worse, the awkwardness of the gift or the fact that everyone knew what it meant. A bearded man in a blue Hermatian leans forward, raising his voice over the chatter. Let's not pretend, he says, that this is just about virtue. We desire the youth because they are beautiful, because they are radiant. The gods themselves took boys as lovers, and now we're off to the myth races. Someone brings up Ganymede, the stunning mortal boy Zeus abducted and brought to Olympus to serve as cupbearer and, well, companion. That's the version cleaned up for school children. The older men grin knowingly. Even the gods, it seems, couldn't resist the pull of young flesh. But not everyone here is buying the poetry. One man, younger than the rest, shifts uncomfortably. He finally speaks. Shouldn't love be between equals, he asks? Not teacher and student, not hunter and prey. The room hushes. He's poking at something delicate, dangerous even. But it's a fair question, and one that modern scholars still debate. Was pederasty a form of grooming, wrapped in the language of virtue? Or was it genuinely educational, albeit framed by different moral standards? Plato had thoughts. Oh boy, did he have thoughts! In the Symposium he presents love as a ladder. At the bottom, physical attraction. At the top, pure contemplation of beauty itself. Ideally, the lover would help the beloved climb that ladder, leaving lust behind for wisdom, but as with all the ladders, some people lingered at the bottom, or never climbed at all. And the Athenians, they built entire social rituals around this dynamic. Love letters carved into gymnasium walls, names whispered during training. Older men would compose songs for their favourites, carefully avoiding anything too obvious. But not really. Everyone knew what was happening. You shift in your seat as the symposium winds down. A few of the men are asleep now, mouths open, heads tilted back. One is singing softly to himself about a boy's hair. Someone else has taken off his sandals and is giving foot massages to whoever will let him. It's equal parts charming and deeply weird. Before you leave, you step out into the courtyard to clear your head. The air is cooler now, the sky darkening. You think about what you've seen and what you haven't. About how love can be worshipped, exploited, redefined and misunderstood, all at the same time. Ancient Greece didn't just allow for contradictions, it seemed to thrive on them. And the Symposium? It wasn't just about sex or drinking, it was about questions that still haunt us. What is love? Who gets to define it? And how do we draw the line between guidance and control, between intimacy and imbalance? You look back at the doorway, where the sound of laughter still echoes. Then you turn, walking into the quiet night with the uneasy knowledge that the past doesn't feel as far away as you thought. You wake the next morning with the sound of sandals scraping across gravel outside your window and the faint tang of stale wine in the back of your throat. The memories of last night's symposium still linger. Philosophers, flirtations, and far too many men quoting Plato with wine-stained lips. But today, your path veers from the airy salons of Athens to a place where the ideals of love and mentorship take on a harder, more brutal edge. You're heading to Sparta. It's a long, dusty road out of the intellectual capital and into the stripped-down austerity of the Peloponnesian hills. The landscape changes quickly. Fewer olive groves, more rocky outcroppings, and fields that seem too stubborn to grow anything soft. Everything in Sparta is harder. The houses are plainer, the streets quieter, the people leaner. Even the air feels denser somehow, like it's been holding its breath for centuries. You pass through the city gates without fanfare. No towering marble statues here. No lyrical inscriptions about the gods. Just stone, discipline, and a hum of distant shouting. Training chants. You're led to a raised platform beside a dirt-floored courtyard. Below, boys as young as 12 run drills barefoot, clad in nothing but short tunics. Sweat and bruises glistening on their backs like battle medals. A lean man with a spear stalks among them, barking orders. Welcome to the Agoge, Sparta's state-run education system, and possibly the toughest boys' club in history. Here, boys were taken from their families at age 7 to live, eat, train, and fight alongside one another. The goal wasn't just physical strength. It was unity, obedience, brotherhood forged in fire. But here's the twist. Their bonds weren't only fraternal. An older boy, a teenager maybe 16, approaches one of the younger ones during a break. He offers water, a bit of dried meat, a slap on the back. The gesture is casual but intimate, and it's not unusual. This was part of the Spartan system. Older boys were encouraged, sometimes required, to take on a younger Eromenos. Unlike in Athens, where pederastic relationships were draped in poetry and negotiation, Sparta made it straightforward. A mentor-protégé bond, cemented through training, trust, and sometimes physical intimacy. One historical account suggests that a Spartan boy who rejected such a bond without a noble reason could be seen as arrogant. That's right, refusing your potential lover could make you look like the problem. Accepting, on the other hand, was framed as honourable, as a sign you were willing to learn, to bond, to grow into a warrior among men. You watch as the pairs move together in a drill, their footwork synchronised, their breaths matched, like twin flames. There's no open affection, no soft words or lingering glances, but there's a closeness, a tension that's impossible to ignore. The scholarly debate around this is fierce. Some argue that the relationships were chaste, based purely on admiration and loyalty. Others, less idealistic, point to Spartan law and culture that openly acknowledged and even institutionalised same-sex relationships. The truth? Probably somewhere messy in between. The Spartans didn't do sentimentality, but they understood the battlefield value of loyalty sharpened by desire, and desire was never far from the surface. One quirky but telling fact: Spartan brides often shaved their heads and dressed like boys on their wedding nights. The implication? That their new husbands were easing into heterosexual relationships after years of more familiar male-centered intimacy. Some scholars brush this off as symbolic gender blending. Others call it what it probably was, a ritualized way to bridge the gap between a man's past and his sanctioned future. You're taken next to a smaller training yard, quieter, where a handful of the older boys spar with wooden swords. One of them, tall and scarred, locks eyes with another mid-match. The younger boy falters just for a second, and the older one grins, just enough to show that their connection goes beyond combat. They circle each other like planets drawn into inevitable orbit. A grizzled overseer notices your lingering gaze and gives a knowing nod. It makes them fight harder, he mutters, makes them bleed for each other, win for each other. His tone isn't mocking, it's proud. To him, this isn't deviance, it's strategy. The idea was simple. Soldiers who loved one another, who shared more than drills and meals, would protect each other with a fierceness unmatched by obligation alone. The bond wasn't weakness, it was armour. And yet there's a discomfort in it too. These boys didn't have much of a choice. The state shaped their minds, their bodies, their affections. What looked like love might also be pressure. What looked like devotion might be survival. No one dared speak against it. That would be soft. And softness? Unforgivable in Sparta. Later, you sit by the Eurotas River, watching as the young trainees wash the dust and sweat from their skin. The water's cold, but they don't flinch. A few wrestle in the shallows, laughter echoing off the stones. You notice again the closeness, the way they touch without hesitation, lean against one another without thinking. You think back to Athens. There, pederasty was wrapped in riddles and rhetoric, dressed up as a noble path to wisdom. In Sparta, it's just one more weapon, stripped of poetry, stripped of ambiguity. If it makes warriors better, it's justified. There's a sort of brutal elegance to it. Society that says, if you must love, let it make you stronger. No apologies, no moral gymnastics. Just unity in the face of annihilation. But still, you wonder, what happens when the war ends, when the swords are sheathed and the drills go quiet? Do these boys still find one another in the dark? Or do they cast off their old affections like broken shields and step into arranged marriages, pretending they never needed more? You watch as the sun sets behind the hills, painting the landscape blood orange. The boys climb out of the river and head back toward camp, muscles gleaming, laughter fading. You stay seated, thinking about how desire, when woven into power, becomes almost invisible, hidden in training, in duty, in culture so thick no one questions the pattern. And yet, under the surface, the questions remain, unchanged, unanswered. Was it love? Was it exploitation? Was it survival? Or was it something the ancients understood better than we dare admit? By now, you've seen Athens in its wine-soaked wisdom, and Sparta in its sunburned severity. You've watched men cry over philosophy and boys bleed over loyalty, and still you haven't hit bottom, not even close. Because for all the political games and gendered rituals, there's another thread in the Greek imagination that winds tighter the more you tug. You're about to follow that thread out of the cities, beyond the hearths and the forums, and into the woods, into the myths, into the wild, dangerous territory of the Amazons. No, not the river, not the online retail empire. The Amazons, those half-real, half-imagined warrior women who haunted Greek nightmares and erotic fantasies in equal measure. You first hear of them in whispers around a campfire, a group of traders swapping stories about a band of women to the east, bow-wielding, horseback-riding, armour-wearing women who took no husbands, bore no kings, and trained their daughters in battle from the moment they could walk. You laugh a little at first. It sounds like a tall tale, some kind of hyper-masculine fever dream spun out of fear and fascination. But the stories keep piling up, all a little too consistent to ignore. Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, who wore a magical girdle and challenged Hercules, and Tiope, who either fell in love with Theseus or was abducted by him, depends on which bard you ask. Pentheus, who charged into the Trojan War and locked eyes with Achilles only seconds before he killed her, and awkwardly, maybe fell in love with her corpse. So here you are, riding along the dusty borderlands, skirting what the Greeks called Scythia, wild territory beyond the edge of their civilized maps. You pass shrines littered with bronze arrows and statues of women with fierce eyes and muscular thighs. The terrain gets rougher. Hills roll like waves, the grass high enough to hide movement. You feel watched. Eventually you spot them, or think you do. A line of figures on horseback, dressed in leather and metal, long hair, braided tight. They move like they own the world. No men in sight. The lead rider slows, circles around, eyes you without a word. Then she vanishes into the brush again, as if daring you to follow, and you don't. You're not that brave, or that foolish. Instead, you make camp and sort through what's real and what's projected. Historically, there were matrilineal tribes in that region, steppe women buried with weapons, wearing armour, riding horses. Archaeologists have confirmed as much. But were they truly man-hating warriors with a taste for conquest and an annual mating ritual involving captured neighbours? Unclear. Some scholars argue the Amazons were Greek propaganda, feminist nightmares invented to define masculinity by contrast. Others think they were simply misunderstood. Fierce, yes, but not mythical. The truth, as usual, floats somewhere in the middle. You remember that in many myths, Amazons are only powerful until they fall in love. The moment one of them surrenders to desire, bam, she dies. Or gets married, which, let's be honest, was sometimes the same thing in Greek storytelling. Antiope, whether she was abducted or not, ends up a wife. Pentheus is strong right up until Achilles sees her, desires her, and destroys her. And that right there is the loop. Power and sex forever entangled. Women who reject men must either be conquered or romanticised into submission. The Greeks loved the idea of the exotic female warrior, but only as long as she eventually gets speared by either a weapon or a wedding. There's even a fringe theory you hear around another campfire, whispered by a traveller from the Black Sea, that Amazon women used to burn off one breast to better fire their bows. Total myth, probably. No physical evidence supports it, but the Greeks repeated it anyway, a kind of surgical metaphor for how unnatural they thought female power had to be. See, they were saying, even women warriors had to mutilate themselves to act like men. And yet, despite all this, the Amazon myth doesn't feel entirely like a warning. There's admiration in it too. The Greek artists couldn't stop painting them. Vases, friezes, shield decorations, everywhere you look. Amazonomachy, scenes of Greeks battling Amazons. Always bloody, always dramatic, always with a strange sensual undertone. You remember one vase you saw in a merchant's home back in Athens? It showed a Greek hero grappling with an Amazon, her legs locked around his waist, sword raised. It was halfway between a fight and a flirtation. That's how the Greeks imagined these women, not as monsters, but as seductive opponents, the ultimate challenge. Which says a lot, doesn't it? For a culture so obsessed with controlling women, marrying them off, secluding them, assigning them roles, the Amazon represented something else. A kind of fantasy, maybe, not just sexual, but social. A world turned upside down, a mirror held up to their own assumptions. You sit by your fire now, the wind picking up, and wonder, what if the Amazons weren't just a myth or an enemy? What if they were a way for the Greeks to explore their own unease with female autonomy? With power they couldn't categorize, desire they couldn't control. After all, they didn't write epics about conquering peasant girls or obedient wives. No, the unforgettable ones, the ones who lived in their imaginations for centuries, were the rule breakers, the bow wielders, the horse riders, the ones who dared to live outside the city walls and said, "We don't need your laws, your gods, or your marriages." And maybe that's why they had to die in the end, because the Greeks needed their women powerful, but only as long as they were defeated. As the fire crackles and the night deepens, you stare into the darkness and half expect to see eyes watching from the hills, not gods, not ghosts, just women who refuse to stay inside the myth they were written into. You shift on your blanket, unsure whether you feel inspired or haunted, possibly both. By now, you've grown used to being surprised. Nothing in ancient Greece is ever exactly what it first seems. Gods disguise themselves, rituals masquerade as parties, and philosophy always comes with a side of flirtation. But just when you think you've wrapped your head around the weirdness, you find yourself in a new kind of chaos, one that's loud, hairy, and permanently aroused. You're deep in the countryside now, past even the Amazon-haunted hills, wandering toward the edge of civilization where the marble columns give way to mossy stone and ivy-thick ruins. This is where the myths don't just live, they party. Welcome to the wild world of satyrs and nymphs, the OG woodland sex fiends of the ancient imagination. The first one you see nearly makes you fall backward into a tree. He's half man, half goat, buck-legged and grinning with teeth too white for someone who's probably never heard of dentistry. He's also fully nude, which doesn't seem to bother him at all. You're about to ask if he needs help when you realise he's not in distress. He's in celebration. He twirls a wineskin over his head and howls toward the sky, and then, from behind the trees, a whole swarm of satyrs come crashing into view. Some are dancing, some are wrestling. One is definitely trying to proposition a tree. They're clumsy, loud, and clearly intoxicated. But they're not monsters. They're more like your friend's chaotic cousin who shows up uninvited to every family reunion, drinks half the punch bowl and somehow leaves with someone's number and no shoes. Now, satyrs were everywhere in Greek myth. They followed Dionysus, of course. He collected weirdos like a frat house collects beer cans. But satyrs weren't exactly gods. They were more like personified urges, not evil but unfiltered. If Dionysus was the god of letting go, satyrs were what you became when you really let go. They had one thing on their mind, and it wasn't philosophy. Or maybe it was, but a very specific branch of philosophy involving thighs and riverbanks. You follow them quietly as they tumble toward a clearing where a group of nymphs lounge by a stream. Now nymphs, unlike satyrs, have a certain elegance. They shimmer in the sunlight, barefoot and draped in sheer fabrics that leave just enough to the imagination. They are beautiful, yes, but also untouchable, ethereal. Some are laughing at the satyrs, others are ignoring them entirely, and at least one looks like she could drown a man just by sighing too hard in his direction. This dynamic, satyrs chasing, nymphs fleeing, was common in Greek art, and at first glance it's uncomfortable. The satyrs are always pursuing, or their arousal often quite literally carved into stone. The nymphs are always running, hiding, or occasionally turning into trees or springs to escape. That's right, transforming into actual geological features to avoid being caught. Which might sound ridiculous until you realise it was probably the only permanent solution they had. It's here that you see a mural etched into a nearby cave wall, probably centuries old. It shows a satyr in mid-chase, reaching for a nymph whose hair is already becoming branches. Her face is serene, his is desperate, and you can't help but wonder, was this supposed to be erotic or tragic, or both? Now, satyrs weren't just visual gags, they were stand-ins for what the Greeks feared inside themselves. Raw, chaotic lust, the kind that doesn't ask, the kind that doesn't think. In plays, especially satyr plays, the raunchy, comedic interludes performed after tragic trilogies, these goatmen would pop in to ruin everything. They'd turn solemn stories into farces. Imagine ending a Shakespearean tragedy only to have a pantsless creature with a flute show up, and start twerking, and the Greeks loved it. But it wasn't just laughs, it was catharsis. Satire plays let audiences purge their darker impulses in a safe, ridiculous space. You could laugh at the fool chasing the nymph, but you also saw yourself in him. The part of you that wanted, even when you shouldn't, the part that desired, even when it was ridiculous. Satyrs were the reminder that you're still an animal, no matter how many temples you build. Meanwhile, the nymphs, despite being constantly chased, weren't exactly passive. Some, like Echo, used their voices to tease or mock. Others lured men into forests and never let them out again. They weren't just pretty faces waiting to be caught, they were symbols of the wild itself. Unpredictable, shifting, alluring, sometimes deadly. One nymph you hear about tonight is Callisto, a companion of Artemis sworn to chastity, until Zeus, dressed as Artemis, yes, cross-dressing again, seduced her. When she became pregnant, she was cast out and later transformed into a bear. Eventually she's set among the stars as the constellation Ursa Major, which is a poetic ending, sure, but also she got tricked, abandoned and turned into wildlife, all because a god couldn't keep it in his tunic. This brings you to a crucial point that still sparks debate. Were these stories cautionary tales? Male fantasies? Metaphors for desire's volatility? Or some blend of all three? Some scholars argue that the satyr-nymph dynamic reflects real-world tensions between urban control and natural freedom, masculine aggression and feminine mystery. Others think it was just theatre, ancient porn with a moral fig leaf. Either way, you can't unsee what you've seen. You sit now at the edge of the clearing, the satyrs dozing off in a heap, wine-stained and snoring. The nymphs have vanished like mist, maybe into the stream, maybe into the trees. The moon is high overhead, casting silver shadows that flicker like candlelight. And as you close your eyes, you wonder which side of the myth you'd rather be on. The fool chasing a fantasy, or the dream slipping through the branches. You wake to the sound of reeds rustling and the distant bleat of goats, fitting given who you're about to meet. The forest is emptied of satyrs and nymphs, but something stranger still hangs in the air, like leftover incense or a half-whispered secret. There's a new path now, carved between twisted trees and slick with the morning dew. It leads you toward a place where prophecy and pageantry collide, where the divine speaks through human mouths, sometimes wearing heels. You've arrived at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, sort of. Not the polished, official one tourists gawk at in the sunlight. You're here for something a little more obscure. Off to the side, hidden beneath a canopy of laurels, there's a smaller structure. Less traffic. Fewer inscriptions. But the rumours, much louder. This is where the oracle lives. But not the oracle. No, not the Pythia, the high priestess whose breathless trances guide empires. You're here to see the other one. The priest who speaks in riddles, whose robes fall just a little too perfectly, whose voice is as smooth as olive oil, and twice as slippery. You step into the vestibule and instantly feel like you've interrupted something fabulous and mildly illegal. The figure before you turns slowly, silk robes fluttering with the drama of someone who knows you're watching. He's tall, adorned with gold bracelets and black coal smeared around his eyes. His beard is finely trimmed, his lips are painted, and his gender. Well, that's the point. You can't quite tell. Nor are you supposed to. This is a space where boundaries dissolve like incense in the air. Masculine, feminine, divine, human. It's all just window dressing. Sit, he says, gesturing to a cushion, as I see what your future's been whispering behind your back. You obey, obviously. As he begins his ritual, burning herbs, chanting in a low, sultry voice, you notice a mask hanging behind him. Half man, half woman. It's not just decoration, it's theology. Here's where things get weird, yes, again. While Delphi is famous for its female seers, many of the lesser-known oracles throughout the Greek world were served by male priests who dressed and behaved in ways that, by modern standards, would be considered gender non-conforming. These weren't jokes or side characters, they were spiritual intermediaries, chosen because they were different, because they didn't fit. In fact, many mystery cults prized this in-between state. To be both and neither was to be closer to the divine. The logic was that gods, especially trickster ones like Hermes or Dionysus, didn't play by human rules, so why should their servants? Our oracle here embodies that ambiguity. He refers to himself with whatever pronouns suit the moment. One breath he's a brother, the next a sister. One moment he speaks in riddles, the next in flirtation, and you can't tell whether he's reading your future or just toying with your insecurities. Either way, you're hooked. He offers you a cup, a small, delicate vessel filled with something dark and spicy. You sip. It tastes like clove and honey with a bite that makes your eyes water. Truth hurts, he says with a wink. Then the trance begins. His hands move slowly over your head, not touching, just hovering, as if feeling for invisible threads. He whispers in a dead language, probably Greek, maybe gibberish, and then begins to hum. The hum becomes a melody. The melody becomes a scream, not of pain but release, and then silence. He opens his eyes, and for a second they glow gold. You're running, he says, from a truth you don't want to name. You try to protest, but he cuts you off with a finger to your lips. Shh, let's not ruin the moment with denial. And just like that, you're swept back into the flow of Greek ritual, where sexuality and prophecy entwine like vines. This is more than theatre. This is performance as revelation. His body, his voice, his transformation, it's all part of the ritual, not a sideshow. The main event. Scholars still argue about how common these gender-fluid oracles really were. Some point to evidence from Anatolian and Phrygian cults, where priests of Cybele, the Galli, performed ecstatic rituals, sometimes castrating themselves as an offering to the goddess and living as women from that day forward. Others dismiss these accounts as exotic exaggerations. But there's no denying the Greeks believed in liminal figures, those who stood between categories and were therefore closer to gods. One especially quirky record mentions a travelling priest who offered womb blessing rituals and insisted he could grant fertility to men and women alike. Snake oil, maybe, or divine confidence. Either way, he made a living. You ask the oracle his name, he smiles. "What's the point?" he says. "Call me what you wish." They always do. And suddenly, the future feels less like a path and more like a costume rack. You can try on any version of yourself, walk in any direction, be the hero, the lover, the fool, or all three in rotation. As the session ends, he presses something into your hand, a small charm, an eye carved into onyx. For clarity, he says, not accuracy, just clarity. You step back into the daylight, blinking, the forest no longer quite so solid. The leaves shimmer like scales, the path shifts when you're not looking. You feel changed, or maybe you're just reminded of something you've always known, that identity isn't fixed, it's a ritual, a performance, a prophecy still unfolding. Behind you the oracle sings a soft tune, part lullaby, part dirge. His voice carries on the wind long after you've gone, wrapping around your shoulders like a veil. And maybe, just maybe, he was right. You are running, but now at least you know what from. By now you're learning not to blink too long in ancient Greece. 1 second, you're sipping wine with bearded philosophers. The next, you're being psychoanalyzed by a gender-bending oracle who may or may not have read your soul like a cheap romance scroll. You step away from Delphi not entirely sure who you are anymore, but that's probably the point. Today, though, your journey takes you even deeper into the divine blender, where gender is less a category and more a fluid, glittering suggestion. You're heading to a shrine not found on many maps. The locals call it the Grove of Both Faces, though the official records prefer to ignore it. Tucked between a river bend and a crumbling hill, it's a quiet place. Serene, no statues with swinging swords or glorious war scenes. Just a few carved stones half swallowed by moss and a single column painted in fading gold, where the figure carved into the side refuses to pick a side or. This is the sacred space of Hermaphroditus, and if you're squinting at the name, yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. The child of Hermes and Aphrodite, born of speed and seduction, of masculine daring and feminine charm. The result? A being so stunning, so divine that mortals didn't quite know what to do with them. And, predictably, neither do modern scholars. You sit in the shade near the altar and run your hand over a worn relief. It shows Hermaphroditus mid-transformation, curves softening, limbs elongating, something rising, something falling. It's delicate and chaotic all at once, like trying to hold smoke in your palms. In the myth, Hermaphroditus is a beautiful youth, bathing alone in a secluded spring. Enter Salmacis, a nymph with zero impulse control and a whole lot of confidence. She sees him, falls instantly in lust, throws herself at him. and when he resists, she prays to the gods to unite them forever. And the gods, being both literal and terrible at boundaries, grant her wish. The two bodies merge into one, not just side by side, but fluted. A single figure, both male and female, permanently entwined. You probably have questions, like, were we supposed to find this beautiful? Tragic. Hilarious. The Greeks, ever the overachievers, seemed to pick all three. One camp saw Hermaphroditus as a cautionary tale. Don't bathe alone, don't tempt fate. Definitely don't reject overly forward water spirits. Another camp viewed them as an emblem of harmony, the union of opposites, the perfect balance, a walking yin-yang in a linen tunic. And then there's the fringe theory that Hermaphroditus was worshipped not in spite of their duality, but because of it. That certain cults saw in them the embodiment of fertility, transformation, and ultimate truth. The idea that gender, like the gods, refuses to be pinned down. There's even some archaeological backup. You recall an old statuette found in Cyprus. From the front, it's a graceful bare-breasted figure with flowing hair. From the back, unmistakably male. The craftsmanship is stunning, and more importantly, it wasn't hidden. It was found in a domestic shrine displayed openly. Whoever owned it didn't just accept Hermaphroditus, they honoured them. Today you watch as a lone pilgrim approaches the altar. They are draped in both a tunic and a shawl, masculine and feminine garments layered like skin. They place a small mirror at the foot of the column, then kneel. No words, just the act. You wonder if they're praying to be changed, or accepted, or simply seen. You walk around the grove and find other offerings, coins with double faces, twin pairs of sandals, one large, one small, arranged like someone left in the middle of a dance. There's even a clay figurine with no distinct features at all, just smooth contours and open arms. You pause at a carved inscription, barely legible in the light. To the one who is both and neither, bless me with what the world fears to name, it hits you harder than expected. Because whether you're in ancient Greece or not, the truth hasn't aged a day. The fear of difference, the power of ambiguity, the need to place every person, every god in a labelled box. And here's Hermaphroditus, laughing gently at the idea, wearing every label like an accessory, and none of them like a burden. Some scholars argue that the Greeks tolerated this ambiguity more than we give them credit for. Others claim it was all just symbolic, used to titillate, not to teach. But the artifacts say otherwise. Hermaphroditus shows up in private homes, bathhouses, even on drinking vessels. Not always as a joke, sometimes reverent, sometimes sensual, always present. You sit again under the fading gold column, and a breeze rustles through the trees. It's soft but layered, cool at first, then warm. You can't tell where it's coming from. It touches every part of you without asking permission, just like the myths do, just like the Ys. And you wonder, if only for a second, what it would feel like to wear both faces, to stop choosing, to live not in the middle, but in the whole. As the sun begins to dip below the hills, casting long, strange shadows, you stand and leave the grove behind. But you don't feel alone. You feel watched, accompanied, not judged, not praised, just observed. As if someone, or something, is curious about who you'll become next. And maybe, if you ask the right question, Hermaphroditus would answer, but only in a whisper, only in a mirror. You're starting to suspect that ancient Greece was less a civilization and more a curated fever dream. One day you're dodging flirtatious satyrs in the woods, the next you're sipping something spicy with a prophetic gender illusionist under a painted column. And just when you think you've acclimated to the wildness, Greece throws another curveball your way, this time one that forces you to question whether the sacred and the scandalous were ever really separate at all. You find yourself in Corinth now, the port city that smells of fish, foreign spices, and faintly of scandal. Ships from every corner of the Mediterranean unload goods and gossip here. You can hear 6 different languages just walking from the docks to the nearest olive cart. But you're not here for olives. You're here to climb. Atop a rocky outcrop sits the Acra Corinth, a fortress of sorts, but more importantly, a temple. And not just any temple. This one is dedicated to Aphrodite, and according to the more enthusiastic ancient historians, it was staffed by 1,000 sacred prostitutes. Let's pause there. That number's been debated more fiercely than a holiday dinner with too much wine. Some scholars say it's exaggeration. probably invented by rival cities to smear Corinth's reputation. Others believe it's plausible if you stretch the definitions and throw in a few metaphors. But whether it was 10 women or 1,000, the idea of sacred prostitution in ancient Greece has lodged itself firmly into the collective imagination. And it's here, in Corinth, that the legend breathes loudest. You climb the winding path up the hill, the stones beneath your sandals are warm, and the air is thick with the buzz of cicadas and the scent of time crushed underfoot. At the top, the ruins spread out before you, sun-bleached pillars, fallen walls, and the broken remains of what once was one of the most talked-about temples in the ancient world. Even in its ruined state, the place hums. There's a woman standing near the centre of the sanctuary. She's barefoot, dressed in a deep red robe cinched with a gold cord. You think she's a tourist until she turns and greets you like she's been expecting you. She introduces herself not with a name, but a title. Hierodule, a sacred servant. You blink, she smiles. People assume we sold our bodies, she says, her voice low and musical. But we were the ones who knew what bodies were for. She explains, slowly and deliberately, that the rituals performed here weren't about commerce, they were about devotion. That when pilgrims came to the temple to seek favour from Aphrodite, they were met not with sermons or scrolls, but with touch, connection, intimacy sanctified by purpose. It was worship, not of her, the priestess, but through her. An offering made in flesh, not words. You sit beside her on a cracked stone slab, the city below you glinting in the afternoon sun. She speaks of rituals performed at dusk when the sky turned violet and the torches were lit. Pilgrims came not just for pleasure, but for healing, for fertility, for forgiveness. Sex, in this context, wasn't a sin, it was a bridge to the divine. And here's where things get murky. Ancient sources don't agree on how widespread temple prostitution really was. Some claim it was rare, regional, possibly even misunderstood entirely. Others argue it was symbolic, an allegory for spiritual union, not a literal transaction. But there's one undeniable truth. The Greeks saw sex and divinity as deeply intertwined. You recall earlier stories, Aphrodite's own affair with Ares, witnessed by the gods and laughed about publicly. Zeus transforming into everything from a swan to a golden shower just to get laid. Desire wasn't hidden in shame, it strutted across Olympus in full view, so the idea that someone might offer their body as part of a sacred act. Not so strange in that context, at least not to them, and yet, there's that tension. The same culture that could carve erotica onto drinking vessels still clung to ideas of female chastity and public modesty. Women in most Greek cities were confined, guarded, often seen as property, except here, except now. In Corinth, on this hill, in this temple, women led the ritual. They were the intermediaries, the touch points between human and divine. You ask the woman if she considers what she does empowering. She laughs, a deep belly-shaking laugh that's too rich for the question. It's not about power, she says, it's about presence. You fall into silence after that, listening to the wind slide through the broken columns. Below, the city churns. But up here, time holds still. She hands you a small token before you leave. A carved stone heart, worn smooth by years of handling. Give this to someone, she says. Not because you owe them, because you see them. You make your way back down the hill with your thoughts dragging behind you like a second cloak. The narrative of sacred prostitution might never be fully clarified. Maybe it was more theatre than truth, maybe it was just another projection of male fantasy. But for a moment, standing beside that priestess, you felt something ancient and strange and surprisingly gentle. The idea that desire could be ritual, that touch could be holy, that maybe we're not meant to separate the body from the sacred quite as cleanly as we pretend. And the thought stays with you all the way down, like the imprint of a warm hand on your shoulder. You've spent enough time now in the blurred margins of myth and memory to know that very little in ancient Greece was ever what it claimed to be. A priest might wear a veil and tell fortunes while slipping into verse. A sacred rite might double as an erotic performance, and a god might visit disguised as a bird, a bull, or your neighbour's exceptionally charming cousin. So when someone tells you that tonight, you're heading to a wedding, you don't get your hopes up for anything as simple as vows and cake. You arrive just outside Athens as the sun dips below the horizon, turning the sky into a smear of pink and rust. The house is modest, walled off from the road by a tidy courtyard and a row of clay pots filled with herbs. Music leaks through the walls, flute and lyre, and there's laughter, high and nervous. You're greeted by a woman who introduces herself as the aunt of the bride. She hands you a flower crown, waves you inside, and says, "Stay near the back, you'll want a good angle when the curtain drops." Excuse me? The room is candlelit, fragrant with myrrh and buzzing with expectation. Women cluster in the corners, whispering, fanning themselves. A few are drunk already. The bride is nowhere to be seen, but you catch glimpses of the groom, tall, anxious, clutching a shallow wine cup like it's a flotation device. He's flanked by friends and older relatives, all trying and failing to look casual. This is no ordinary wedding night. This is a ritual. In many Greek city-states, especially Athens, marriage wasn't just a legal arrangement. It was a ceremonial rebranding. A girl, usually around 14, would be taken from her father's house and given to her husband, who might be twice her age or more. The wedding itself spanned several days and included sacrifices, processions, and a lot of pretending this was romantic rather than transactional. But the real drama happened later, behind closed doors, in the bridal chamber. You're ushered quietly to an adjacent room where a delicate curtain hangs across a doorway. This is the anaclypteria, the ritual unveiling of the bride. It's private, technically, but privacy in ancient Greece had layers. You might not be in the room, but you definitely hear the cries, the laughter, the silence. A woman in front of you leans over and whispers, "First time?" You nod. She smirks. Then brace yourself, it's not always elegant. The bride is brought in, veiled, eyes downcast, wearing white. Her hair is braided intricately, and she walks slowly, deliberately, like she's not entirely present. This is part of the rite, symbolic death. She's no longer a child, no longer part of her natal home. In the myths, Persephone is taken by Hades into the underworld. In real life, brides were escorted, but the parallel wasn't subtle. The torchlight, the silence, the ceremonial dragging of feet, it all mimics abduction, transformation. She's led to the thalamus, the inner room, where the bed is freshly made with olive branches and woven cloth. The groom is waiting. Someone hands him a belt to untie. It's symbolic too, his right to access, to initiation. And then the curtain is drawn. Now, to be clear, you're not witnessing anything explicit. This isn't a voyeuristic theatre. But you do hear the ritual chant begin, a call to Aphrodite and Hymenaios, the gods of love and marriage. You hear soft music, the low murmur of voices, and then, eventually, silence. There's a lot of debate around this part of the tradition. Some sources describe the unveiling as joyful, even playful, a moment of discovery and delight. Others hint at something darker, that the bride might cry, that the act was less consensual than ceremonial, that what mattered wasn't passion, but proof. And yes, the bed sheets were often inspected afterward. Virginity was social currency, especially for women. A bride who didn't bleed on the wedding night could bring dishonour, accusations, even annulment. And yet, paradoxically, Greek myth is full of women who defy or evade that standard. Goddesses like Artemis, who never married, or mortal women like Atalanta, who challenged would-be suitors to foot races and then destroyed them. The cultural script demanded chastity, but the stories often admired rebellion. Here's a fringe detail. In some regions, especially rural areas, a ritual called Gamalion involved symbolic acts of defloration using fruit or tools, an olive branch, a pomegranate, even a spindle. Scholars debate whether these were literal substitutes or just metaphorical props in a highly choreographed drama. Either way, the symbolism was clear. Womanhood wasn't something you were born with. It was conferred, through ritual, through marriage, through a sanctioned crossing of the body's threshold. Back in the house, the music picks up. The women around you begin to sing. It's not a solemn hymn, it's bawdy, teasing, full of double meanings and unashamed laughter. One older woman stands and belts out a verse about a goat who got married and still preferred figs. You don't get it, but everyone else does. The room dissolves into giggles. This is part of the healing, maybe. The balance. The wedding night begins with fear, vulnerability, the weight of expectation, and ends, ideally, in joy. Not just for the couple, but for the community. This wasn't just about two people. It was about lineage, alliances, the continuation of households. Sex was a civic duty. And failure. Social catastrophe. You glance again toward the curtain, still drawn, still silent. But the bride's veil is now folded on a nearby stool, a small subtle shift. She is no longer anonymous, no longer hidden. She has crossed over. You leave the house with the crowd as the stars emerge overhead. The air smells like crushed rosemary and roasted lamb. Somewhere inside, the couple begins the rest of their lives. Awkwardly, perhaps, but publicly blessed. And as you walk back down the narrow path, flower crowned slightly askew, you wonder if anyone, gods included, was ever really ready for that kind of unveiling. You wake up still wearing the flower crown, bits of dried petals stuck in your hair like regrets after a festival. Last night's wedding, with its candle-lit tension and half-heard giggles behind the veil, has left something lodged in your chest. Not quite sadness, not quite awe. You've seen sex as prophecy, sex as performance, and now sex as a civic formality, practically notarized by family elders with olives and veiled threats. But if you think the Greeks are done surprising you, think again. Today you're heading to a celebration where everything you thought was sacred becomes slippery, loud, and slightly phallic. It's time for a fertility festival. You don't walk to this one, you're swept there, herded by a crowd of women, men, children, and a goat wearing a flower crown more elaborate than yours. You're in a village nestled between hills, the kind of place where people still talk to their neighbours and everyone knows who's behind on their grain taxes. But today, none of that matters. Today is for Demeter. Yes, Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, grain, motherhood, and grief. She's usually portrayed with a serene, matronly face holding a sheaf of wheat and being very above it all. But not today. Today she's the star of the Thesmophoria, a women-only fertility festival that begins solemnly and ends with, well, just wait. You're given a robe, plain linen, and belted high at the waist. Someone smears ash across your forehead. A sprig of mint is tucked into your sash. These aren't decorations, they're symbols. Purification, renewal, life after death. Which seems dramatic until you realise the festival revolves around the myth of Demeter, losing her daughter Persephone to the underworld and mourning herself nearly into starvation. You'd think a story about abduction and forced marriage wouldn't inspire a party, but this is Greece. Everything inspires a party. The first day is serious. The women fast, sleep outdoors, chant under the stars. It's more funeral than festival. They grieve. Not just for Persephone, but for all the things women lose. Children, youth, autonomy, the ability to choose their own endings. There's a heaviness in the rituals, even as the fire crackles and smoke curls into the sky. But the next day, it begins with food. Honey cakes shaped like genitalia for starters. You think it's a joke until you see a child try to eat one upside down and an old woman slap the cake out of his hand while cackling. Then come the songs, which are crude, loud, and stunningly creative. You don't understand half the slang, but the general gist is this. Nature is messy, life is messy, and bodies, especially female ones, are meant to be celebrated, not hidden. Then someone brings out the effigies. Yes, those effigies. Dozens of them, carved from wood, bread, and even clay, oversized phalluses, some with ribbons, others with googly eyes painted on them. The women hoist them like parade floats and start dancing, not with irony, but with the kind of joy you usually only see at weddings or lottery wins. This is part of the ritual, a symbolic reenactment of renewal, of planting seeds, of making sure the earth, and by extension the women, are fertile for the coming year. It sounds ridiculous, and maybe it is, but there's a reverence in it too, a sense that this loud, lewd ritual is tapping into something deep and ancient. For a culture so obsessed with control, city walls, laws, hierarchies, this is the opposite. This is chaos in service of creation. Scholars have tried to unpack the Thesmophoria for centuries. Was it a religious rite? Political gathering? A female-only safe space disguised as a harvest party? There's evidence women used the festival to swap news, share birth control tricks, yes, really, and maybe even plan protests. One inscription suggests that some wives used it as an excuse to ditch their husbands for days. Another text implies that women took turns making fertility jokes at each other's expense until someone cried. It's hard to say what's true and what's satire, but the real star of the day is the megara, a pit, dug earlier in the year and filled with offerings. Rotting pig carcasses, sacred cakes, and allegedly, other things we won't name in polite company. These decomposed into what the women called holy compost. Today the pits are opened, and the contents, now a rank slush, are scooped out with ceremonial shovels and sprinkled over fields and gardens. You gag a little. The priestess smirks. "This is what life grows from," she says. "Get used to the smell. It's humbling. You've seen polished temples and perfumed rituals. Now you're watching women anoint the earth with pig goo and laughing while they do it. They chant Demeter's name, not like she's some distant untouchable deity, but like she's a sister, a grieving mother, a woman who's been through hell and clawed her way back with dirt under her nails. And then, as the sun dips low, there's silence. A girl, barely old enough to understand the weight of the moment, steps forward. She holds a small statue of Persephone, carved from ivory. The priestess leads her to the centre of the field. Together they place the figure in the soil, a symbolic return, a promise of spring. The crowd hums a low, rhythmic chant. You feel the earth shift beneath you. Not literally, but something is turning, renewing, waiting. One last detail catches your attention. A woman standing off to the side, cradling a clay tablet. She's writing something slowly and deliberately, a name, a wish, maybe a curse. The Greeks were known to bury such tablets in sacred soil, hoping Demeter or the underworld might carry the message along. You think about writing one yourself, not a curse, just a question. Something about balance, or maybe forgiveness. But you don't. Instead, you let the ritual carry you. As the festival winds down, the wine flows again. The phallic effigies are passed around for one final toast. You drink too, feeling the heat rise in your face. It's not arousal. It's not piety. It's something else. The recognition that even the messiest parts of life, decay, sex, birth, grief, deserve their place in the myth. Because the Greeks knew something we often forget. You don't get spring without winter. You don't get fertility without a little rot. And you don't get rebirth without first a very strange dance holding a cake shaped like a penis. You leave the Thesmophoria smelling like burnt ash, honey cakes, and, unfortunately, fermented pig slush. The sun's setting behind the hills now, bleeding orange and violet over the fields freshly blessed with sacred compost. As the village fades behind you, so does the echo of women's laughter, raucous, unfiltered, ancient in its joy. For a festival ostensibly about farming, it felt more like collective therapy with snacks and ritual nudity. You're beginning to realise that ancient Greek sexuality wasn't confined to bedrooms or scrolls. It pulsed through every festival, every rite, every chant shouted into the night. But tonight you find yourself in a quieter place, less crowded, less festive, more conflicted. You meet him at the edge of a camp outside Thebes, where soldiers are sharpening spears and tying leather sandals with a precision that only war and looming mortality can produce. He's young, maybe 18, a fresh hoplite, his breastplate gleaming like he's never seen battle, his eyes both eager and unsure. His name is Cleon, and while he doesn't know it yet, he's the embodiment of a rarely discussed figure in Greek sexuality, the male virgin. You think that term would raise eyebrows in this world, where young men are expected to drink, fight and bed someone, anyone, before their first grey hair. But Cleon doesn't blush when he tells you. He says it flatly, like it's a choice, something deliberate. "I'm saving myself," he says, eyes scanning the horizon. "Not for marriage, not for a woman. For glory." It sounds ridiculous until you see the way he says it. With conviction, with pride, you follow him through the camp as he prepares for the coming battle. The other men joke, jeer, make crude gestures, but he shrugs them off. He isn't doing this for them. He's part of a different tradition, one not spoken as loudly but deeply rooted in certain corners of the ancient world. See, the Greeks weren't as universally hedonistic as their reputation suggests. Sure, they had orgies, symposiums, sacred prostitution, but they also had schools of thought that praised restraint, even celibacy. The philosopher Pythagoras, for example, discouraged sexual activity, believing it drained the soul and muddied the intellect. Some athletes avoided sex before competitions, convinced it sapped their strength. And then there were warriors like Cleon, who believed abstaining sharpened focus, clarified purpose, a kind of spiritual edge before entering the chaos of war. There's even an odd historical footnote about Spartan soldiers being forbidden from sleeping with their wives too frequently, lest their passion make them soft. Soft hearts make soft swords, apparently. Cleon shows you a small token he carries, an amulet shaped like a spearhead wrapped in twine. "It was my brother's," he says. He died before he ever touched a woman. They said that's why the gods took him, but I think maybe he was chosen. You don't know how to respond to that. You're not sure anyone does, but you sit with him as the sky darkens and the camp grows quiet, fires flickering like nervous stars. Here's a fringe detail. While female virginity was obsessively monitored and mythologized, male virginity wasn't exactly taboo, but it was definitely not cool. In Homeric epics, heroes are expected to sow some serious wild oats before they die gloriously. But there's a strange reverence too, for untouched warriors, men who dedicate themselves so fully to battle or the gods that earthly pleasures become distractions. Think of Achilles, who, depending on the version, is either passionately entangled with Patroclus or almost childlike in his detachment. A man too pure or too rage-filled for intimacy. That's the tension. The Greeks respected desire, but they also feared it. Feared that it could unman a warrior, distract a thinker, derail a life meant for greatness. Self-control wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. Back in the camp, Cleon is sharpening his blade, not obsessively, but calmly, with ritual, like each motion is a prayer. You ask if he ever wants to break his vow. Of course, he says, not looking up. Every day. He pauses, then adds, but if I die tomorrow, at least I'll be remembered for something, not just another man chasing softness. You don't know whether to admire him or feel sorry for him, maybe both. The other soldiers call to him, battle drills. He nods to you, tucks the amulet back into his tunic and jogs off. You watch him vanish into the sea of clashing shields and shouting men, just another form in the blur. And you're left alone with a thought that stings more than you expect. In a world that prized control, maybe the most radical form of sexuality while it was refusing to use it at all, some scholars have argued that the concept of male virginity in the ancient world was less about purity and more about potential. An untouched man was a blank slate, untamed, unbound, dangerous. He had nothing to lose. Others suggest it was linked to ritual sacrifice, a pure offering, a body unspoiled by the complications of love or lust. Which feels creepy, yes, but not far off from how some epics treat their youngest, brightest heroes, doomed from the moment they shine. You stare into the fire as the night creeps deeper. Somewhere Cleon is dreaming of glory, or not dreaming at all. You think about the pressure he carries, not just to fight, but to not fall, not to give in, not to touch or be touched. He is his own fortress, untouched walls, unstormed gates, and maybe, just maybe, that makes him lonelier than even he realizes. You lie back on the cool earth, staring at stars that haven't moved in millennia. You've seen desire used as worship, as manipulation, as communion. But now, for the first time, you've seen it as absence, as a thing withheld, and somehow that's just as haunting. Morning rises red and slow, casting long shadows across the battlefield where Cleon and the other hoplites vanished just hours ago. You don't hear war cries or clashing bronze, not yet, only the faint echo of sandals in formation and the rustling of standard banners in the wind. There's a strange silence in the prelude to bloodshed, as if even the gods are holding their breath. You leave the camp behind, walking eastward along a dusty goat path with no destination in mind, just the need to shake off the weight of last night's conversation. But Greece has a way of replacing one mystery with another. By midday, you find yourself standing in front of a small sun-bleached shrine tucked between two cypress trees. It's unassuming, nothing like the columned grandeur of Delphi or the hilltop temples of the gods. A little square of stacked stones, a few offerings, and in the centre, a carved relief of a swan. Uh-oh, you know this swan. Everyone knows this swan. This is Zeus, mid-transformation, mid-seduction, mid-problem. You're looking at one of the most uncomfortable intersections in Greek mythology. Animal shape-shifting and divine desire. Or, to put it bluntly, when the gods got horny and creative. You've heard of Zeus's greatest hits already. His infamous visit to Leda in swan form is just the beginning. There's also Europa, who got carried away on the back of a bull. Danae, impregnated by a literal golden rain. Io, seduced and then turned into a cow. Ganymede, abducted by an eagle. Every story more confusing than the last. And always, the common thread, transformation as a tactic. You walk slowly around the shrine, noting the offerings left by modern hands, figs, dried flowers, a feather. Someone scratched a short prayer into the base of the altar. It's faded, but you can make it out. May desire find me and not destroy me. That pretty much sums it up. These myths weren't just ancient soap operas, they were morality plays, coded warnings, obsessions, fantasies. The gods didn't need to seduce mortals, but they did constantly, often while disguised as animals, clouds, or other people. Why? Scholars are still scratching their heads over that one. Some say it reflects the Greek idea that the divine is unknowable, that it hides behind masks. Others suggest these were elaborate metaphors for the overwhelming, almost animalistic power of desire itself. But there's a darker reading too, one that's hard to ignore when you look closely. Because let's be honest, most of these stories aren't love stories, they're stories of coercion, of pursuit without consent. And yet for centuries they were painted on vases, carved into temple walls, performed in plays, celebrated. You sit on a flat stone in the shade and think about Leda. She doesn't speak in the myth. She's just there, beautiful, passive, the target of a god's attention. Whether she welcomed it or not, doesn't matter. The story isn't about her, it's about Zeus, about power, about the absurd lengths he'll go to in order to have what he wants. And that raises an unsettling question. Were the Greeks fascinated by these myths because they admired them? Or because they feared them? You remember the stories told at the symposium, the way older men spoke of desire as something noble, uplifting, philosophical. But here, in the myths of swans and golden rain, desire feels less noble and more monstrous, not shaped by ethics, but by instinct. Divine instinct, which somehow was allowed to supersede mortal will. A quirky side note, some ancient Greek cults actually worshipped Zeus specifically in his animal forms. There were rituals to Zeus Lycaios, Zeus of the wolf, and temples featuring artwork of his shape-shifted exploits. In some local festivals, people even wore animal masks, dancing through the streets in celebration of these mythic moments. Whether they were mocking, reenacting, or secretly hoping to be chosen, well, that's unclear. And the mortals on the receiving end of these transformations, they were almost always women. Mortals. Powerless. Or in Ganymede's case, a beautiful boy with no say in the matter. Desire flowed downward in Greek myth. Gods onto mortals, men onto women, older onto younger. Consent was rarely part of the narrative. It wasn't about love. It was about reach, about which hands got to grasp and which bodies were expected to bend. You run your fingers along the feather someone left behind and think about how often the Greeks described passion as madness. Eros wasn't gentle. He struck like a weapon. He upended order. Even the gods weren't safe from him. Ares and Aphrodite, Zeus and Hera, Hades and Persephone. No one loved calmly in Greek myth. They lusted. They pursued. They burned. But you also start to notice something else. Something that complicates all this further. The way the victims in these stories are later elevated. Leda becomes the mother of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. Danae births Perseus. Europa's name lives on in a continent. Their suffering becomes legacy, which is a very Greek way of justifying trauma. Turn it into myth, then turn myth into meaning. The wind picks up, rustling through the cypress trees. You close your eyes and try to imagine what it felt like to be Leda, walking by a river, watching a swan land gracefully in the reeds, not knowing that a god was hidden inside its feathers, and then, what? A touch. A sudden shushift. A confusion that never clears. Or maybe the myth is the confusion itself, a way of naming the unnameable, of talking around something too uncomfortable to say directly. You open your eyes and glance again at the prayer carved into the altar. May desire find me and not destroy me. It's a fragile hope, but an honest one. You stand or brush dust from your clothes and leave the swan shrine behind. The road stretches ahead, golden and sun-drenched, but somehow heavier than before. You've seen love as discipline, sex as ritual, virginity as virtue. And now, desire as distortion. An act of transformation, yes, but not always one you choose. The sun is high again, beating down on the back of your neck like a relentless reminder that Greece is as much a land of fire as it is of myth. You walk with dust clinging to your feet, the image of Zeus as a swan still fluttering through your thoughts like a half-remembered fever dream. You've started to recognize the patterns now, the way desire in ancient Greece tends to arrive cloaked, animal-shaped, divine and irresistible. But today's stop takes you to a darker corner of that obsession, where the line between magic and manipulation blurs, and love becomes a battlefield fought with whispers, wax, and the occasional human tooth. Welcome to the realm of katadesmoi, the Greek curse tablets, specifically the erotic ones. You find the first one buried literally in a graveyard outside a dusty provincial town. The earth is loose here, picked over by centuries of farmers, looters, and careless archaeologists. But the tablet is still intact, a thin sheet of lead, folded over like a private note, etched with shaky but furious handwriting. Someone's desperate plea to bind the desire of another person, to make them come, to make them stay, to make them suffer if they refuse. This is not a love poem, it's a weapon. You sit on a nearby stone and unroll a translated version, carefully copied by some long-dead scholar with an eye for the illicit. The words are painful, furious, trembling with lust. The writer calls upon the underworld gods, Hecate, Hermes Chthonios, sometimes even Persephone herself, to help them tie the will of another person, usually a romantic target, to their own. These were known as Eros-binding spells, and they weren't subtle. I bind Sostratos to me, to burn with desire until he cannot eat, sleep, or think of anything but me. May his eyes only see my face, may his loins be inflamed, may he feel pain if he looks at another. You flinch just a little, because it's familiar, isn't it? That aching kind of wanting, the kind you don't know what to do with, the kind that makes you say things, please look at me just once more, into pillows and empty wine cups. The only difference is, the Greeks weren't shy about outsourcing the dirty work to the gods, or the dead. These curse tablets were often buried in graves, wells, or hidden beneath thresholds, any place where spirits might hover, or the earth might act as a conduit. Some even came with dolls, figures made of wax, clay, or lead, sometimes pierced with nails or bound with string. One was found in a woman's grave clutching a figurine and a note. Bring him to me tied and weeping. Romantic, no. Powerful, absolutely. The scholars argue over who used these spells the most. Some say men, trying to control the women who spurned them. Others argue women turned to magic because it was one of the few tools of influence available to them in a society where public agency was limited. Either way, these weren't the actions of people feeling powerful. They were the desperate attempts of people without power, people sidelined, rejected, forgotten. And that makes them kind of heartbreaking. You find a second tablet tucked behind a shrine to Aphrodite. This one is different, written in gentler language. Less command, more plea. The scribe begs the goddess not to force the other person into love, but to reveal the love that's surely already there. Let her know what I know. Let her feel what I feel. No threats, just aching hope. You wonder if the spell ever worked, if the woman in question ever showed up at the caster's door, touched by some divine nudge. Of course, the Greeks weren't the only ones with love spells, but they made a whole genre out of them. Entire scrolls were filled with incantations, recipes. Really, mix the blood of a bat with ash from a wedding torch. Whisper the name of your beloved into the wind on the third night of the waxing moon. Tie a strand of their hair around a black stone and bury it under your bed. Do it wrong, and the desire might come back to you like a boomerang, distorted and punishing. There was always risk. No spell came without consequence. One wrong word, one careless burial site, and you might end up with something far worse than unrequited love. Madness, obsession, death. In a fringe example, there's an old legend about a man who cursed his ex-lover to never enjoy another's touch. The spell worked. Too well. She wasted away, sick with invisible fire, unable to rest. He tried to undo it, but the gods weren't interested in second chances. Back in the present, you sit quietly with the little lead tablet in your hands, imagining the fingers that once etched those letters, the breath behind the words, the cracked lips whispering it into dirt. And it strikes you that so many of these curses sound less like hatred and more like longing twisted out of shape, like love that curdled into possession, which raises the uncomfortable question: how often does desire turn toward control? Where does passion end and coercion begin? You think back to all the stories you've heard: Zeus disguised and descending, Aphrodite manipulating hearts with golden girdles, even the humble human lovers wielding spells not out of cruelty but out of desperation. No one wants to be powerless in love, especially not the Greeks, and yet, in their relentless effort to make someone feel what they felt, to bind hearts and bodies like furniture, they revealed something strangely universal. Love is terrifying. Not just the pain of rejection, but the vulnerability of it, the exposure, to want someone and not be wanted back. It's a kind of death. So they whisper to the gods, or to the dirt, or to the grave, "Make them want me, make them see me, please." The wind kicks up around you, lifting a cloud of dust. You bury the tablet again, not because you believe in the curse, but because it feels wrong to keep it, like carrying someone else's heartbreak in your pocket. You walk on past olive trees and lizards sunning on cracked stone, and you realise you're not leaving these spells behind so much as carrying them with you, because we still do this, don't we? The candle rituals, the desperate texts, the social media stalking, the whispered what-ifs into the darkness. Maybe we don't write the names on lead anymore, but we write them somewhere, on our mirrors, on our skin, in the hollow part of our chest. The Greeks just had the honesty to call it magic. You walk until your feet ache, until the roads turn from dusty to damp, and the air changes from dry olive and sun-scorched stone to something cooler, saltier. You've reached the sea again. Not a port this time, not a raucous harbour bustling with merchants shouting over crates of figs and fish. This coast is quieter, framed by the white cliffs and tangled brush. You stand at the edge of a village perched above the Aegean, its homes scattered like thrown dice across the hills. And here, rising in the distance like a stone secret, is the island of Lesbos. You've heard the rumours already, everyone has, that the women here are different, that they speak in honeyed verses and sleep tangled together beneath the stars, that they compose songs with their fingertips and teach each other more than music. But none of that prepares you for Sappho. Her name is a myth, a whisper, a footnote in trembling scripts. The ancient Greeks called her the 10th Muse. Later scholars couldn't decide whether to praise her or erase her. Some admired her for inventing a new poetic form. Others flinched at what she said so plainly, that love between women wasn't a crime or an accident, it was an ache, a flame, a fact. You don't meet Sappho herself, of course. She's long gone, scattered to the winds and burned into fragments by fire, time and Christian censors. But you find echoes of her everywhere. In the ruins of a school, where she supposedly taught young women poetry and music. In the gardens blooming with myrtle and thyme. And in the scrolls passed from hand to trembling hand, filled with words that still sting like wine in an empty stomach. You sit in a stone courtyard surrounded by women, students, poets, priestesses, skeptics. One of them reads from a fragile scrap of papyrus, her voice low and reverent. He seems to me equal to the gods, that man who sits across from you face to face listening to your sweet voice and lovely laughter. Oh, it makes my heart flutter in my chest. There's silence after that. Not out of discomfort, but reverence. No giggling, no smirks. Just the slow exhale of everyone thinking, yes, I felt that. Here's the truth the myths never told you. The Greeks had no neat category for lesbianism. There was no word that matched what we mean by it today. Female-female desire wasn't outlawed exactly, but it wasn't celebrated either. It was overlooked, or wrapped in metaphor. If it didn't produce heirs, it didn't threaten the patriarchy, so women could whisper, could write, could touch in the shadows. As long as no one made a fuss, Sappho made a fuss. She wrote openly of her longing, her jealousy, her despair. Not always to named lovers, but often to unnamed yous, the kind that feel achingly universal. She wrote about soft hands, about the tremble in her knees, about the way desire could make her tongue stop working. There's nothing abstract about it. She's not hiding behind metaphor. She's telling you, I want her, I love her, I'm undone. And yet, only fragments of her work survive, roughly 650 poems reduced to a handful of verses. The rest, lost, burned, or reimagined by later translators who couldn't bear to leave the she in her love poems intact. They swapped pronouns like it was housekeeping, turned her desire into something safe, something that could pass as devotion, not attraction. It's still happening. You talk to one of the women at the courtyard's edge. She tells you about how even now, scholars debate whether Sappho was really a lesbian. Maybe she was writing metaphor. Maybe her school was purely academic. Maybe the word love meant something different. Anything, really, to avoid saying the obvious. She lived on an island full of women, the woman says. She wrote poems about how much she missed their touch, and we're still asking if she liked girls. You nod, point taken, and yet there's also tenderness in the mystery, the lack of hard definition. Maybe that's part of Sappho's power. She resists clarity. She doesn't give you a manifesto, she gives you a heartbeat. A shiver. A line that ends too soon and leaves you haunted for the rest of the page. There's one story that stands out though, one that's hard to ignore, the myth of her suicide. Supposedly, Sappho leapt to her death from the cliffs of Leucadia over unrequited love for a ferryman named Phaon. It's a neat little tragedy, perfectly Greek, but also suspicious. Most modern historians think the whole thing was made up, a later attempt to straighten her legacy, to fit her into the mould of noble heartbreak, as if she couldn't just love women, as if she needed a man to die over. You walk to the edge of a cliff anyway, not Leucadia, but close enough. The sea spreads out before you, glittering and infinite. You imagine her here, Sappho, feet bare, scroll in hand, composing not for fame, but for the unbearable weight of her own chest. You can almost hear her voice in the wind. Love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain falling on oaks. You don't need to know who she meant. You already know. One quirky fact. In ancient Sparta, brides would sometimes sing Sappho's verses during pre-wedding rituals. Yes, even when marrying men. The irony's rich. A poet whose work drips with longing for women being used to usher girls into heterosexual marriage. But maybe it was a wink. A silent rebellion dressed up as tradition. You leave Lesbos with your bag heavier, not from souvenirs, but from fragments, lines, glances, that feeling that someone once said exactly what you feel, and you didn't even know it had been written down. That's what Sappho gives you. Not answers, but permission. And maybe that's enough. You leave Lesbos with your head full of wind and poetry, carrying Sappho's fragments in your chest like loose stones. There's something about her voice, what little survives of it, that stays with you longer than the louder myths. It's not just the longing or the beauty, though those are plenty. It's the fact that she dared to name desire in a world that tried to fold it into metaphors and look the other way. But as the waves fade behind you, so does that softness. Because the next place on your path is louder, rawer, and let's just say a lot more exposed. You're heading to Olympia, but not for the temples or the statues. You're going for the naked men, specifically the athletes. You step onto the training grounds just after dawn, and they're already there, young, oiled, and glistening like the covers of romance novels that haven't been invented yet. There's nothing coy about it. Everyone's naked. Completely, not a fig leaf in sight. And no, it's not a kink, it's the standard. The Greek word gymnos literally means naked, which is where we get gymnasium. So yes, every time you groan your way through a treadmill session, you're participating in a long tradition of sweaty public body worship. Minus the nudity, probably. You sit near a row of low benches, trying not to look like a pervert while men of every height and shade stretch, grapple, and sprint. There's a formality to it, but it's also clearly about showing off. They flex, they admire one another. They make casual bets and laugh at the losers. It's part sport, part ritual, and part social performance. In Greek culture, the male body was more than admired. It was idealized. The Kouros statues, those smooth, stylized youths carved in perfect symmetry, weren't just art. They were the blueprint. Beauty was equated with goodness, morality, even divine favor. If you looked like a god, maybe you were chosen by one. Of course, this admiration wasn't just aesthetic, it bled into the erotic. You already saw it in the symposiums and the warrior mentorships, but here, in the gymnasium, it's almost absurdly open. You overhear one man compliment another's thighs with the kind of language usually reserved for wine tastings, full, firm, and with excellent finish. You can't tell if he's flirting or recruiting for a wrestling team. But what strikes you most isn't the nudity, it's the lack of shame. No one's hiding, no one's posturing, okay, maybe a little, but not in the self-conscious way you're used to. These men have trained their bodies, and now they're on display, not just for personal glory, but as symbols of the city-state itself. A beautiful citizen was seen as a reflection of a healthy society. So when these men competed nude in the Olympic Games, they weren't just athletes, they were living propaganda. That said, things weren't exactly equal across the board. Women weren't allowed to watch the games, at all. Married women caught in the crowd could be put to death, which is wild, considering women had their own version of the Olympics, sort of. The Heraean Games, held in honour of Hera, featured female foot races, but the athletes wore tunics, short, yes, but not nothing. The body was never neutral, it always said something, and in this world, male nudity was strength. Female nudity, complicated. You remember hearing about an exception to the rule? A woman named Cleopatra disguised herself as a man to watch her son compete. When he won, she leapt over the barrier to celebrate, and her robes slipped. Scandal. But instead of punishing her, they let her go, because her whole family had a tradition of Olympic winners. After that, though, all trainers had to be naked too, just in case. Leave it to the Greeks to solve a gender problem with more nudity. But here's where things get interesting. Public nudity in Greek culture wasn't universally accepted from the beginning. In Homeric times, athletes wore loincloths. It wasn't until the 6th century BCE that the full nude tradition took hold. Some say it started when an athlete lost his loincloth during a race, won anyway, and everyone realised, hey, maybe this is better. Functional and fashionable. There were critics, though. Philosophers like Socrates and Plato had mixed feelings. Plato, famously obsessed with ideal forms, loved the idea of physical perfection, but worried about where it could lead. Nakedness, after all, isn't always just athletic. It's erotic, and when you have a bunch of teenage boys oiling each other up before wrestling matches, things can get complicated. That's the thing, modesty in ancient Greece wasn't about covering up, it was about context. A naked man in the gymnasium? Fine. A naked man weeping in public? Embarrassing. A woman's ankle exposed at a funeral? Scandalous. A woman's breast exposed at a fertility ritual? Sacred. It all depended on the setting, the purpose, the who, and the why. You take a break under the olive trees, watching a pair of athletes spar, slow at first, then faster, grunting, grabbing, their limbs tangled in a way that's either extremely competitive or foreplay. You can't tell, neither can they, probably. And you think about how far we've come, or haven't. The way modern societies still can't decide if nudity is empowering or degrading, art or sondel, celebration or shame. The Greeks didn't have all the answers, but at least they picked a lane. In their world, a naked man running full speed with a javelin wasn't obscene. He was a hero. Of course, that only worked if you were the right kind of man, beautiful, athletic, Greek. Slaves and foreigners didn't get statues made of their bodies. And for women, their beauty was idealized, but their visibility was limited. Their public presence, especially their sexuality, was monitored, mythologized or hidden behind poetry. Still, you can't shake the feeling that they understood something we've forgotten, that the body in its natural state is not automatically shameful, that being seen isn't always the same as being violated, and that sometimes standing naked in the sun with your shoulders back and your thighs flexed is an act of worship. You leave the gymnasium with your clothes still on, thankfully, but your thoughts are a little lighter, a little freer. You've seen bodies used for war, for theatre, for seduction, for ceremony, and now for celebration. And you wonder, as you walk through the streets of Olympia, what your own body might say if it could speak in that language. If it would boast or blush. Either way, it would probably ask for more olive oil. You're still thinking about all that oil when you arrive in the heart of Athens again. Your skin sun-warmed, your sandals dusty, and your inner monologue just slightly more confident than it used to be. You've seen sacred sex, forbidden desires, oiled-up gymnasts and women hurling pig rot at the soil in Demeter's name, and somehow all of it fits together, like fragments of a mosaic slowly revealing an image that refuses to be respectable. But tonight, the gods aren't your destination, nor are the athletes, the oracles, or the priestesses. Tonight, you're headed for the theatre, and not just any theatre. You're walking straight into a sex comedy. Don't expect subtlety. The theatre of Dionysus hugs the southern slope of the Acropolis like a lazy thought, open to the sky, its stone benches worn smooth by centuries of audiences who came for catharsis and left with wine breath and sore ribs. You take a seat among them now, tucked between a mustachioed merchant snoring gently to your left, and a young couple feeding each other olives to your right. The crowd is buzzing, not with reverence, but with anticipation. They're here for the rude stuff, the bawdy stuff. The kind of show that makes polite dinner conversation extremely awkward the next day. A man steps onto the stage in a tunic that's clearly 2 sizes too short. He's wearing a giant leather phallus strapped to his waist, comically large, flopping with every step. The crowd erupts in laughter before he even opens his mouth. You try not to stare. You fail. Welcome to old comedy. This genre, loud, raunchy, and politically fearless, flourished in 5th century BC Athens and wasn't just tolerated. It was celebrated. No one was safe. Politicians, poets, philosophers, and gods all got skewered with equal enthusiasm. But what modern audiences often forget is that these plays weren't just crude, they were wildly sexual, and deliberately so. The play begins with a monologue about a man who's lost his wife because he was too cheap to buy her decent sandals. Then it quickly devolves into a plot involving a talking sausage, a seductive chorus of dancing vegetables, and a donkey that may or may not be pregnant with Zeus's love child. You blink, you gape, you laugh once you get past the surrealism, and the penis jokes, endless. Ancient Greek comedies were famous for phalloi, those exaggerated props used not just for laughs but for symbolic power. A big one suggested virility, charisma, political superiority. A floppy one, ridicule, impotence, incompetence. The audience judged characters as much by the tilt of their stage genitals as by their dialogue. Subtlety was not the point. Aristophanes, the comedic king of the era, specialised in this kind of highbrow smut. His plays, Lysistrata, the clouds, the frogs, are packed with sexual wordplay, absurd situations, and genuinely sharp social commentary. In Lysistrata, women band together and refuse to have sex with their husbands until they end a war. That's the entire plot, and it's treated both as comedy and revolutionary statement. Imagine a modern play where an all-women sex strike brings down the Pentagon. That's the vibe. But it wasn't just about cheap laughs or civic protest. Sex in comedy was a way to crack open deeper truths. The body was funny, yes, but it was also political. Who could touch whom? Who controlled desire? Whose pleasure mattered? All of these were up for debate, right there on the stage in front of everyone. Even the front row city officials, probably blushing behind their togas. There's a scholarly debate about whether this level of openness reflected real-life behaviour, or if it was theatrical fantasy. Were Athenians actually this relaxed about sex? Or was comedy the only socially acceptable place to process what couldn't be said elsewhere? Some argue that these plays acted as pressure valves, letting citizens release tension and taboo through laughter. Others believe the constant stream of phallic humour reveals a culture genuinely obsessed with sexual dynamics, more honest, less polite. What's clear is that audiences loved it. Even during times of war, plague, or political unrest, the theatres were packed. Laughter wasn't just entertainment, it was survival, and sex, no matter how awkward, ridiculous, or exaggerated, was part of the human condition. To mock it was to humanise it. A particularly memorable scene unfolds on stage now. A character disguised as a woman attempts to seduce a politician using a magic ointment made from goat fat and figs. When he accidentally rubs it on the wrong spot, his genitals inflate to grotesque proportions, causing him to float off the stage like a balloon. The audience howls. Someone next to you wheezes, tears streaming down his face. The merchant wakes from his nap, sees the giant floating phallus, and immediately starts clapping. It's chaos, and it's perfect. You take a moment to look around. The audience is made up of all classes: farmers, aristocrats, fishmongers, kids who are definitely too young for this, old women shouting commentary mid-performance. Everyone is here, and no one's pretending to be shocked. Because this is catharsis, not the tragic kind where you watch a hero fall nobly into death. No, this is the kind where you see your neighbour get mocked for snoring during sex and feel just a little better about your own misadventures. One quirky fact, the chorus in these comedies often dressed in absurd costumes, frogs, wasps, birds, and sang songs that ranged from dirty limericks to genuinely moving odes about peace and mortality. They'd break the fourth wall, mock the playwrights, flirt with the audience, and then go right back to dancing. They were the beating, absurd heart of the production. As the play winds down, the actors line up still in costume, bowing as the audience tosses flower petals and the occasional fig onto the stage. You clap, a little stunned, a little euphoric. You've just witnessed something ancient and deeply human, the need to laugh at our bodies, our urges, our stupid mistakes, and the courage to do it in public together. You leave the theatre under the rising moon, a soft breeze carrying the scent of roasted garlic and worn sandals. You pass a group of teens reenacting one of the scenes, badly. The one girl ties a carrot to her waist and starts shouting in verse. Everyone collapses in laughter, and you think, somewhere, Aristophanes is cackling, because desire, absurdity, and social critique all dance together on that stage, not in opposition, but in harmony. And if a floating penis can say something true about the human condition, maybe nothing's off limits. You're still giggling from last night's theatre when the sun returns with a vengeance, baking the city in a golden glow so intense it feels like the gods are daring mortals to go outside. But you do, because your next stop isn't for tourists. It's dinner at a private home. Nothing flashy, just a stone courtyard, ivy-covered columns, and enough wine to embalm a centaur. Tonight, you're sitting in on a banquet hosted by one of Athens' more eccentric elites. And if that sounds familiar, it should. But this time there's no symposium, no speeches on virtue, no Socratic flirting. This dinner is theatre, with better snacks. Your host is Caliganins, a man whose moustache twitches whenever he's about to insult someone. He greets you with the exaggerated enthusiasm of a man who likes being watched. His house slaves glide silently from kitchen to table, placing figs, cheese, roast quail, and bowls of dipping sauces that probably all contain olive oil and something vaguely suspicious. You're seated on a cushion, sandals off, robe slightly loosened, and already tipsy from the welcome drink. The sun hasn't even set yet, and then the entertainment begins. No lyre player, no flute girl, not yet. Instead, Caligan's clears his throat and says, "Tonight, we are dining with Aristophanes." There's a groan from someone across the table, but it's not the annoyed kind. It's the kind that means this again, with a smile. And suddenly, half the guests are on their feet, grabbing masks from a basket near the garden wall. One dons a pig snout. Another wears a fake beard made of straw. And one woman, yes, there are a few women here, very scandalously, straps on a comically large leather phallus and announces, "I am the Oracle of Delphalus. I come bearing truths." You brace yourself. The skit that follows is half-recited Aristophanes, half-drunken improv, and entirely chaotic. One character pretends to be Lysistrata. Another impersonates a Spartan general with a stutter. They argue about politics, bread prices, and swan erectile dysfunction. Everything devolves into a mock debate where the solution to Athens' financial crisis is apparently massaging the Acropolis. The guests laugh so hard you see wine shoot out of one man's nose. And yet beneath the laughter, something deeper hums. Because Aristophanes' plays weren't just about jokes, they were social x-rays, revealing what lay beneath Athenian pride. Hypocrisy, fear, longing. And nothing escaped his scrutiny. War, politics, sex, philosophy, masculinity, women's rights. Or lack thereof. You watch the actors stumble into a parody of the Assemblywomen, a lesser-known comedy where women secretly take over the Athenian government by dressing as men. Once in power, they institute radical equality, communal property, shared wealth, universal sex access. Yes, really. And while the audience roars at the absurdity, you start to see the satire biting at the edges of laughter. It's funny because it's terrifying. It's terrifying because it's too close to real. Calligenes claps and calls for another course. Honeyed dormice. You pass politely and sip more wine. One woman, still in costume, sits beside you. Her name is Diane, and she's studying Aristophanes with what she calls a grudge and a wine budget. She tells you that every time she performs one of his monologues, she feels like she's borrowing his permission to say the things that aren't supposed to be said. That laughter in these settings becomes armour, a shield, and sometimes a knife. She leans closer, whispers, "The Greeks pretended comedy was harmless, but comedy has always been dangerous." And she's right. One fringe historical tidbit. In some city-states, especially under Roman rule later on, certain comedies were censored or banned outright. Too raunchy, too politically subversive. And yet in Athens, during the height of democracy, they were encouraged. It's as if the city believed that true freedom meant the freedom to mock itself. Even its gods, even its heroes. No sacred cow stayed sacred for long. If someone important hadn't been ridiculed by Aristophanes, were they even important? You glance around the table now and realise no one's pretending to be dignified anymore. One man is reenacting the mating call of a philosopher. Someone else is trying to quote Euripides while hiccuping. Even Caligenes is slumped sideways, his moustache half submerged in a bowl of olives. This isn't just dinner, it's ritual disarmament. And here's the weird beauty of it. Sex is still in the room. Always. It's in the jokes, the props, the lingering looks exchanged across wine cups. But it's not there for titillation. It's not there to impress or conquer. It's there because it's human, ridiculous, necessary. Comedy lets it be all those things at once. You think back to the theatre, to the floating phallus, the pregnant donkey, the sausage politician. All of it seemed absurd. But it also said something truer than most philosophy lectures. that sometimes the most honest things you can say are the ones that make people laugh. As the night wears on, the skits slow, the food dwindles, and someone starts singing a bawdy hymn to Aphrodite, half prayer, half punchline. You lie back against your cushion, stomach full, face flushed, heart oddly light. The moon hangs above like an audience member who never leaves, watching, amused, unimpressed. And you realise that sex in ancient Greece wasn't always sacred, scandalous, or spiritual. Sometimes it was just funny. The stories, the satire, the social commentary wrapped in innuendo, they weren't meant to instruct. They were meant to reflect, to throw your own nonsense back at you until you either cried or laughed it out. You leave the banquet long after midnight, your steps uneven, your grin stubborn. A line from the play echoes in your ears, slurred but memorable. Let the gods have Olympus, we have wine and thighs. Fair trade, honestly. Morning hits you like a leftover amphora to the skull, slightly warm, definitely too loud and full of regret. Your head is thick with the aftermath of wine and comedic innuendo, and for a moment you consider sleeping under the olive tree you've found yourself beneath. But Greece waits for no one, not even hungover time travellers, so you pull yourself together, sip something that vaguely resembles tea and vaguely resembles punishment, and follow the dusty road to your next destination. You're not sure what you're looking for until you realise you're chasing Aphrodite again. She's been following you this whole time, hasn't she? The goddess of love, beauty, sex, chaos. Sometimes she's a statue, other times a whisper in a woman's laugh. She's the incense smoke in the Thesmophoria, the salt on Sappho's tongue, the reason someone scribbled desperate curses on lead tablets and buried them with the dead. She is everywhere, and today you're visiting one of her oldest sanctuaries, an ancient temple not marked by grandeur, but by what people left behind. You arrive in Pavos, on the island of Cyprus, Aphrodite's mythical birthplace. Here, the sea foams not with romance, but with raw, relentless force, crashing against black volcanic rock in a way that feels entirely personal. You remember the myth? She emerged from the waves after Kronos castrated Uranus and tossed his severed genitals into the sea. Yeah, romantic origin stories weren't exactly the Greek strong suit. You walk along the beach, your feet sinking into wet sand as you approach what's left of her first sanctuary. It's mostly ruins now, crumbling columns, scattered altars, shards of pottery half buried in the grass. But there's still something alive here, a pulse under the earth. You step onto the worn stones and immediately feel it. This wasn't a place for quiet devotion. This was a place for rituals, for ceremonies, for offerings, and not just candles and flowers. You kneel near one of the outer altars and spot a fragment of terracotta shaped like a breast. At first you think it's part of a statue, but then you notice another, and another, then a phallus. Dozens, maybe hundreds of votive offerings, all shaped like body parts. Breasts, genitals, hips, thighs. Left here millennia ago as tributes to Aphrodite. This is how people prayed to her, not just with words but with pieces of the body. Sometimes literal representations, sometimes symbolic ones. They weren't asking for favours exactly. They were asking to be seen, to be healed, to be loved, to be desired. Some archaeologists argue these were anatomical votives offered in hopes of curing ailments, infertility, impotence, infections, but the sheer eroticism of the shapes suggests something deeper. These weren't offerings made in shame, they were made with pride. A woman leaves a carved clay breast and asks Aphrodite to make her irresistible. A man leaves a phallus and asks for strength, virility, maybe just some extra luck at the next festival. And here's where the fringe detail drops in. In some regions, couples left paired offerings, one part each, linked with thread or inscriptions. Sometimes they added locks of hair or bits of jewellery. It wasn't just about individual healing. It was about binding themselves together in front of the goddess, as if to say, we want this, let it last. You sit back and look around at all the fragmented terracotta body parts. It's weird, it's beautiful, it's honest, because what is love if not a collection of vulnerable pieces? Later, as you wander the sanctuary grounds, you stumble across a stone basin filled with still water. Once this was where priestesses would wash the offerings, or maybe the devotees themselves. Water, after all, was sacred to Aphrodite, her birthplace, her element, her mirror. You lean over and catch your reflection, half melted by the ripples, and for a moment she's there. Not Aphrodite as marble goddess, not the distant beauty immortalized in statues, but something else, a flicker in the eyes, a curve of the mouth, a presence that feels entirely personal, entirely yours. You sit with that feeling for a while. Here's something odd. Unlike many gods, Aphrodite had few temples built for grand spectacle. Her shrines were often modest, tucked near springs, coastal cliffs, places where earth and water met. Some scholars think this was deliberate, that Aphrodite didn't want towering columns or towering sermons. She wanted something more intimate, closer to skin than to sky. You think back on all the places you've met her so far. Corinth, in the temple said to house sacred sex workers. Lesbos in the verses of woman who bled poetry. Athens, in the middle of a sex comedy. She's never been far. And always a little unexpected. That's her gift and her danger. The Greeks didn't worship Aphrodite out of simple adoration. They feared her too. She was the one who could unravel cities with a glance. The one who made men abandon kingdoms for a single kiss. The one who punished those who refused her, like Hippolytus, who died in a chariot crash after rejecting all things sexual. Or the women of Lemnos, cursed with a stench so vile their husbands fled. Spoiler, that was her doing too. Desire, the Greeks knew, was not a gentle force. It created, it destroyed. And Aphrodite? She held both reins. You leave a small offering of your own, just a pebble from the beach, smoothed by waves and warm in your palm. You place it beside the broken phallus and whisper something you don't quite want to admit, even to yourself. Maybe it's a hope, maybe a regret. Either way, it belongs here now. The sea is roaring louder as you walk back along the cliff. A group of young women passes you, each carrying a small jar. They're headed toward the sanctuary, laughing softly, skirts brushing against wild time. One turns to you and says, "You should have seen it at dusk. She glows." You believe her, because in a land where gods wear too many faces, Aphrodite wears them all. The lover, the destroyer, the healer, the joke, the curse, the prayer. And this temple, crumbling though it may be, still beats with her rhythm. Love in ancient Greece wasn't sweet. It wasn't pure, it was messy, strategic, ecstatic, devastating. And Aphrodite, whether invoked with terracotta breasts or whispered wishes, was the goddess who held that mess like a lover holds your name. You don't speak for a while as you walk inland again, your sandals quiet on the chalky path, the last trace of Aphrodite's sanctuary still clinging to you like the salt on your skin. It's strange how her presence stays even when the temple fades from view. She's a little like smoke that way, impossible to hold, impossible to forget. And now, as the hills begin to shift into pine and stone and the sea fades into memory behind you, you arrive somewhere colder, older and darker. Not in climate exactly, but in tone, because now you're heading underground. Literally. You've reached Eleusis, the shadowed city where Demeter's most secret mysteries were performed. But you're not here for agriculture this time. You're here for something far stranger. Initiation. The Eleusinian mysteries were the biggest spiritual event in ancient Greece. An exclusive ticketed affair for the soul. Anyone could attend as long as they spoke Greek and hadn't committed murder. That was the bar. The rituals? Still a secret, even after 2,000 years, but rumours persist. Whispers about what really happened behind the veils and doors under the night sky. In the torchlit halls where gods were remembered and the dead were glimpsed. You're led by a woman named Megale. Tall and quiet, dressed in dark robes. She doesn't speak at first, just gestures for you to follow. Past olive groves, past silent pillars. Down into the Telesterion, the great initiation hall where the mysteries reach their climax. It's not grand, not anymore. Just stone walls and shadows, but there's something there, something dense in the air. You feel it settle on your chest, humming. Leave behind what you think you know, Megale says finally, her voice soft. The mysteries weren't for learning, they were for unmaking, and unmaking is exactly what they did. The Eleusinian mysteries were centered on the myth of Demeter and Persephone. Yes, the same tale that launched the fertility festival you barely survived. But this version is quieter, more intimate, less pig rot, more existential dread. It's about descent, about Persephone's abduction into the underworld and her mother's grief, about what's lost and what returns. And sex, though never named, is everywhere in that myth. Hades didn't just kidnap Persephone, he took her as a bride. The implication was clear, she was initiated into womanhood not by choice but by force. And yet within the mysteries this wasn't treated as a moral failing. It was a metaphor. For death, for transformation. for the brutal, necessary shift from innocence to experience. That's the thing no one says out loud. Sex, in Greek myth, often stands in for death. Or maybe the other way around. To enter another body is to lose part of yourself, to descend, to emerge changed. That's the initiation. The rites began with a walk, from Athens to Eleusis, miles on foot. Pilgrims fasted, bathed, carried torches. They offered piglets to the gods, then left them behind. They sang. They drank a potion called kykeon, a barley and mint brew that may or may not have contained hallucinogens. Then finally they entered the hall where something happened. And no one talks about it. Not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. To reveal the rites was punishable by death, and despite centuries of historians, philosophers, and drunks trying to spill the beans, no one ever did. What we do know is this. Initiates came out changed. They claimed to no longer fear death. They claimed to have seen something, perhaps Persephone herself, or the moment of her return, or something more symbolic, the divine cycle of life, death, and rebirth, mirrored in the womb and the tomb. You sit in the centre of the telesterion now, alone, but not alone. The room seems to breathe. You imagine the torches lining the walls, the murmurs of the crowd, the low rhythm of feet shuffling, robes rustling. And then, something. A sound, a light, a gesture, the myth made real, or the body made metaphor. One theory goes that a sacred object was revealed, a stalk of grain maybe, simple, but seen in the right moment after fasting, walking, drinking, believing, that grain becomes everything. Sex, death, resurrection, the thin thread that holds us together and pulls us forward. Another theory, Fringe whispered, is that sacred intercourse took place. Not orgies like people love to imagine, but symbolic union. A reenactment of Persephone's descent, of Hades' taking, of the seed entering the soil. Scholar poets and swandle chasers alike have speculated that a priest and priestess embodied the gods, performing a ritualized sexual act for the audience, not as pornography but as sacrament. No one can prove it, no one ever will, but sitting here in this cold stone silence you understand how it could be true. Because sex, at its deepest, is transformation. Not pleasure alone, not power alone, but crossing from one self to another, from one life to another, from breath to something deeper. You think of Persephone, not the victim, not the flower-picking maiden, but the queen of the underworld. The one who swallowed the pomegranate, who chose or didn't choose, but lived anyway. She isn't rescued. She returns, changed. That's what the mysteries offered. Not innocence, but survival. Megale returns, carrying a torch now. She doesn't speak, but she looks at you for a long time, then holds out her hand. You follow down her back to the surface. The sky has gone red with dusk. The sun lowering behind the hills like a coin sinking into a dark well. Before you go, she places a small object in your hand. It's warm, rounded, a carved pomegranate seed. Now you've seen, she says, and you realise the mysteries were never about solving death. They were about making peace with it, about understanding that everything sacred, life, sex, love, grief, requires descent, that to emerge into the light you must first be taken, or go willingly. You walk away from Eleusis not enlightened, not exalted, but quietly undone, which somehow feels like the point. The road back from Eleusis is quiet. Even the wind seems hesitant to speak, like it knows you've been somewhere you shouldn't name out loud. You still have the pomegranate seed in your pocket. It's light, but it feels heavy, like it could pull you down into the earth if you let it. You walk slowly, retracing the sacred route taken by thousands of initiates over centuries. And now, even with all you've seen, temples, sex rites, love spells, oil-soaked athletes, there's one part of the ancient Greek world you haven't faced directly, not just what they did with sex, but what they feared. You arrive at a small town clinging to the edge of the Peloponnesian hills, nothing like the glitter of Athens or the sacred hum of Delphi. This place is raw. Stone walls, crooked alleyways, the smell of smoke and wet clay. And here, tucked beneath the edge of a hill, is the home of a pharmacist, a sorceress, a woman who lives just outside the rules. She greets you without a word, just a sharp glance and a tilt of the head, motioning for you to follow her inside. The air is thick with herbs, burning sage, dried lavender, something a little more acrid. On the walls hang little pouches tied with hair and feathers, a few bones, a mirror with no reflection. You're not in a temple. You're not even in polite society anymore. You've stepped into the world of female power unfiltered, and it makes everyone uncomfortable. This woman, nameless to you, is known in whispers as a love witch. Not in the Valentine's Day sense. She deals in desire, yes, but also in poison. She brews potions for passion, for infertility, for revenge. Her shop is where desperate people go when the gods don't answer. And tonight, you're going to learn her craft. She places a bowl between you and begins to mix something dark. A root is crushed, a red powder stirred, honey added to bind it. As she works, she tells you, without looking up, that the line between medicine and magic has always been imaginary. The same plant that stops a womb can make someone fall in love, or hallucinate, or sleep forever. It all depends on the dose, and your intention. You're starting to see how ritual and recipe share more than a few syllables. Sex magic in ancient Greece wasn't rare, it was just whispered. Women who practiced it outside temples, beyond the sanctioned rites of Aphrodite, were feared. They didn't ask the gods, they didn't wait for husbands. They bent reality with their own hands, which made them useful and dangerous. One common spell involved tying knots, binding spells again, but this time, instead of lead tablets buried with corpses, these were worn against the skin, braided threads tied to the thigh or wrist, infused with oils, whispering desire with every step. The witch tells you that her grandmother used to make them for girls, hoping to keep the attention of married lovers. She laughs, low and dry. Didn't always work. Sometimes they stuck too well. You're shown a jar of what looks like beeswax. It's infused with herbs, and according to the witch, it's meant to soften the threshold. You don't ask which one. She shrugs, then mutters something about pleasure as persuasion, and you suddenly feel like an amateur. What strikes you, though, isn't the shock factor, it's how matter-of-fact she is. None of this is presented as scandal, it's craft. Knowledge passed down like sourdough starter, taught in kitchens, not academies. This is sex divorced from shame. Or maybe it's sex weaponized from shame, because that's what these women learned to do. Survive in a world where they were valued for their bodies and then punished for using them. The Greeks both worshipped and feared women's sexuality. They built temples to Aphrodite and told stories about dangerous enchantresses. Think Circe. Think Medea, women who used their sexuality not just to seduce but to transform and destroy. Circe turns men into pigs. Medea burns the world down for betrayal. Both punished not because they were witches, but because they were uncontrollable. And the love witch you're with now, she knows that's the real threat. Not sex itself, but women who direct it. Women who don't wait for permission. There's a scroll on her shelf filled with old writing, spells, ingredients, symbols for Venus, Mars, Mercury. You run your fingers along the edge and ask if she ever wrote her own. She smiles. Once, but it worked too well. And that's all she says. She hands you a pouch before you leave. Inside is a dried flower, dark red, twisted, and a note. Crush under moorage, under moonlight. Do not speak. You laugh until you realise she's not joking. Back outside, the night has dropped like a curtain. The stars are thick, the road feels narrower, and you think again about how every culture has its witches, its wild women who know just a little too much. The Greeks dressed theirs in myth, in mockery, in tragedy, but they never forgot them, and they never truly erased them. One scholarly debate lingers. Were these witches real, or were they projections, myths born of male anxiety? Maybe both. Maybe the Pharmakeis was just the village herbalist. Or maybe she was a conduit for every fear men had about being undone by women who didn't follow the script. And maybe, just maybe, that fear was justified. You walk away with the pouch tight in your fist, your mind a tangle of spells and history and all the unspoken power women had to claim in secret. You think about all the times desire has been called dangerous, and all the times it actually was, because love here isn't just emotion, it's action, it's transformation, it's risk. And for those who learn to master it outside temples, outside marriage beds, outside society's approval, it was power. You don't crush the flower, not yet, but the idea of it lingers, and that's what makes it magic. By now you've wandered through temples, symposiums, theatres, brothels and caves. You've watched gods seduce mortals, mortals seduce each other, women seduce power, and power seduce everyone. You've met poets and prostitutes, virgins and warriors, priests, witches, and comic actors with £10 phalluses strapped to their waists. Ancient Greece hasn't just opened its bedroom to you, it's pulled you into its bed, whispered in your ear, and then asked what you're doing in the morning. But there's one last place you need to go, not to learn something new exactly, but to see how it ends, because even sex has a finale, and in Greece it usually involves a funeral. You arrive in a quiet town near the outskirts of Boeotia. The hills roll softly here, dotted with cypress trees and low stone tombs. There's a funeral procession moving slowly down the road, women in black robes, men with downcast eyes, and a flute player filling the air with notes so sorrowful they sound like scenes. You're not part of the funeral, but no one stops you from following. Grief, like everything else here, is communal. The body belongs to a man named Menandros, an old poet who, according to whispers, was more famous for his lovers than his verses. His wife walks ahead, but so does the young man you don't recognise, tall, tense with red-rimmed eyes. You wonder if he's the apprentice, or something more. The procession leads to the family tomb. A priest steps forward to offer a eulogy, the usual stuff, noble, wise, beloved. Then unexpectedly a woman steps up. Her voice is low and strong, and her words are nothing like the priest's. She speaks of Menandros not as an idea, but as a body. She describes his laughter, his hands, the way he danced even when no music played. She says, his life was not measured in drachma or honour, but in touch, and in who he dared to love. There's a beat of silence. No one looks at each other. The priest clears his throat awkwardly, and then she finishes, "May the dead be remembered whole." And just like that you realise, the ancient Greeks, for all their rituals and categories, could never quite decide what to do with desire after death. On the one hand, funerary inscriptions often sanitize the deceased, especially women. A wife might be described as modest, loyal, and silent, whether she actually was or not. You could live a scandalous, sensual life and still be remembered as a paragon of virtue, if your family had the right stonemason. But on the other hand, there were the grave reliefs, the epitaphs that slipped past the censors. You've seen them, the ones where a young man clasps another man's hand too tenderly. The ones where a woman stares out, not demure, but knowing. They didn't erase desire completely, they just tried to tame it in marble. You walk through the graveyard after the crowd has gone, studying the stelae. Here's one, a young woman with a dove in her hand and a slight smile. The inscription reads, "To Callisto, who sang even when the lyre broke." Below it, someone scratched in faint letters, "I kissed her once, under the fig tree." It's hard to tell when that was added, days after the funeral or centuries later. But either way, it's still here, and that's what matters. The Greeks believed that memory kept the soul alive, that to speak a name was to keep someone from fading completely. And love, physical, passionate, reckless love, was as much a part of someone's legacy as their noble deeds or well-bred children. The myth of Achilles and Patroclus, after all, doesn't just survive because of war. It survives because of grief. Because of how fiercely one man loved another. And that love had a body. One fringe discovery that still puzzles archaeologists. In a tomb near Corinth, they found two skeletons buried together. Both male, arms interlocked, their grave goods including matched rings and a single lyre. No inscriptions, no explanation. Just the bones. But bones don't lie. Someone made sure they stayed together, even if no one wrote down why. Maybe they didn't need to. You sit beside one of the older tombs nowadays, where the stone is worn so smooth it looks like the shape of sleep. You think about everyone you've met, real or imagined, on this journey. The women tossing pigs into pits, the teenage boys avoiding sex to focus on battle glory, the poets spinning verse about laughter and skin, the lovers whispering names into dirt. They weren't just celebrating sex, they were clinging to it, using it as a form of memory, of rebellion, of permanence, because bodies rot, statues fall, cities burn. But love, at least the kind bold enough to touch another person fully, has a chance of being remembered, even if only in fragments. And so much of this has been fragments, hasn't it? Sappho's poems, half lost. The cursed tablets buried in forgotten wells, the scratched-in graffiti on the side of a bathhouse, a doll buried in a grave clutching someone's name, desire scattered like breadcrumbs across centuries. And yet, here you are, piecing it together. You stand and begin to walk away, past the quiet tombs, the sleeping stones, the olive trees leaning over the dead like old friends. The sun is beginning to dip again, throwing long shadows across the grass, and behind you the wind whispers through the cypress. The Greeks knew something we often forget, that sex and death are twin doors, that to love deeply is to brush against mortality, that every touch is a rehearsal for loss, and that maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it worth doing anyway. You don't say goodbye. You just walk forward, and somewhere behind you Aphrodite smiles,